Before collecting gil ever became a problem, a little-known Japanese game company named Square was having financial troubles of its own. In 1987, they began facing off against another worldly evil known as bankruptcy. After only a few years of development by itself, and under the Disc Original Group collaboration, Square's bottom line was rocked by a string of unsuccessful titles, including The Death Trap, Cruise Chaser Blasty, Alpha, King's Knight, and an alien side-scrolling shooter. Even North American hits like Rad Racer and 3D World Runner were barely enough to keep the company afloat. With the resources for one last effort, Square's Director of Planning and Development, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was given the terrifying task of making a game that could save Square's dwindling future in the industry. When asked what type of game he would like to make, he replied, "I don't think I have what it takes to make a good action game. I think I'm better at telling a story." Taking cues from other RPGs on the market, from Japanese contemporaries like Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, to stateside influences like Ultima, Sakaguchi dreamt up a video game with an immense world map to explore and an engaging tale to tell. Convinced the Famicom RPG would be his swan song, he ironically named it Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was released for the Famicom on December 18, 1987, just 2 days before Sega's Phantasy Star. It was directed by Sakaguchi himself, with character designs by rising manga artist Yoshitaka Amano, and music by Nobuo Uematsu, a veteran video game composer who lent to the project his 16th video game score. It told the story of the 4 warriors of light, bearers of ancient elemental artifacts, and heroes destined to save the land from a growing plague. Despite crystals eventually becoming the central theme of the sprite-based Final Fantasies, the original quest involved retrieving 4 orbs. The only crystal mentioned in the English version was the wizard Matoya's missing eye. The plot sent the 4 light warriors to hunt down the 4 fiends, demons responsible for plunging the world into darkness. This led them to Lich in the Cavern of Earth, Keri in the Gurgu Volcano, Kraken in the Sea Shrine, and Tiamat, high above the Mirage Tower in the floating Sky Castle. But defeating these enemies only revealed a greater threat. They had collectively created the demon Chaos out of the corpse of Garland, the first boss you faced, and sent it back in time. After your team rewound the clock to face him, you learn that Chaos was the one responsible for sending the 4 fiends into the future, creating a cataclysmic and confusing paradox. Once Chaos was crushed, the world righted itself, and the heroes returned home. The story was epic for its time, but far from the gripping, dramatized narratives the series would eventually become known for. Instead, the focus was more on creating a deep, fulfilling, and highly customizable RPG gaming experience. You could name your characters, but with only 4 spaces available, you were essentially playing out one of 6 different archetypes: White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, Thief, Fighter, which later became Warrior, and Black Belt, which later became Monk, allowing for 30 possible group combinations. Your characters battled for money and experience points, powering up to a max level of 50. After a trip through the Castle of Ordeals and a visit to the Dragon King Bahamut, players could graduate their characters to superior jobs, including White Wizard, Black Wizard, Red Wizard, Ninja, Knight, and Master. These optional class upgrades were a first for the genre, and allowed the use of advanced spells and items. The majority of Dragon Quest and Ultima encounters were one-on-one, but in Final Fantasy, you could unexpectedly face off against up to 9 varied enemy types. These encounters were random, whether you accidentally stumbled across a band of wily imps or intentionally stepped forth to retrieve a sacred treasure. Most RPGs displayed their combat engine in first person, but Final Fantasy was the first game to show the heroes on the right side of the screen opposite their opponents on the left. That way you could visibly see who was attacking who on both sides. Primitive as they may appear now, Final Fantasy's battle animations were some of the most advanced graphical effects gamers had ever seen before. There were 8 levels of either black or white magic to learn, with 4 spells available within each. Mages could only learn 3 spells per level, forcing you to choose carefully. In an awkward time before mana or magic points, spells could only be cast if they had charges available. there were no ethers or elixirs, and only houses and inns restored charges. To see the world, players had to traverse an overworld map of 3 large continents, stopping to explore a multi-level dungeon, castle, cave, or rest at a friendly town's inn and shop at its stores. The planet-wide expedition became easier to manage once your party came in control of a boat, a canoe, and eventually an airship. The flying machine granted you complete access to the map without random enemy encounters, provided you could find suitable terrain to land on. The canoe and boat were both open to surprise attacks, but holding A and pressing B several times while out in the open sea started a 15-block minigame that rewarded you with a little extra cash. Final Fantasy had an extensive musical score for its day, with almost 20 different tracks playing out over the course of the game. Several of these would go on to become mainstays in the series, including the title screen arpeggio, the victory fanfare at the end of each battle, and the opening theme, which would evolve into an anthem for the entire franchise. Final Fantasy was not an easy game. You could only save in inns or by using houses, and doing so didn't remove status effects like poison. Fallen allies could only be revived with the White Mage life spell, or by using heart-shaped clinics, which were cross-shaped churches in the Japanese version. Enemies didn't drop items, and some of the later spells became insanely expensive. And then there were ineffective attacks, meaning if one of your party members killed an enemy before the others got a chance to take a shot at him, their moves, or even their magical charges, would be wasted. The monsters would also jump from being a walk in the park to a virtually impossible deathmatch at a moment's notice, and Square would tweak each upcoming sequel in an attempt to balance the overall difficulty level. Fans were willing to put up with the punishment though, because Final Fantasy became one of the most popular RPGs of the 80s, and one of the most successful titles on the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. It planted a seed that flourished into a lucrative series, one that as of last year had sold more than 68 million units worldwide. Final Fantasy has been repurposed for other consoles at least 7 times, more than any other role-playing game. These include the American port in 1990 and upgrades for the MSX, WonderSwan Color, PlayStation 1, Game Boy Advance, mobile phones in Japan, and last month, the PlayStation Portable, giving credence to Sakaguchi's crew that their fantasy was anything but final. The growing popularity of the first Final Fantasy helped the originally unscheduled second installment arrive on Japanese store shelves 364 days later. Since Final Fantasy I was never intended to be a smash hit, its story didn't lend itself to a sequel. Because of this, Square felt the freedom to take numerous aspects of the first game in a completely new direction. Final Fantasy II was released in Japan on December 17, 1988. Sakaguchi, Amano, and Uematsu were back on board for the sequel, as well as several members from the original development team. The story began with 4 youngsters fleeing the forces of the Emperor of Palamecia, who had attacked their hometown of Fynn and killed their parents. While there was no prophecy that said they were destined to destroy evil and save their world, the heroes eventually became a humble warrior, a cautious mage, a simple-minded monk, and a morally conflicted Dark Knight. But unlike Final Fantasy I, there was no opportunity to upgrade these classes. For the first time, they were ingrained into their characters. They also didn't level up like their predecessors. Instead, the individual attributes of each character leveled up, including hit points, magic power, stamina, strength, spirit, agility, intelligence, and evasion. These categories would grow stronger the more they were used or needed, and the same was true for weapons and spells. Focusing on a character's melee or magical abilities would cause the opposite to be adversely affected, forcing players to choose one or the other. This new system was designed to create a more realistic progression formula based on cause and effect, and give the player more control over what piece of armor, type of weapon, or brand of magic they wanted to increase in power. However, it opened up several opportunities to cheat the system and build up your characters much faster than intended. When you canceled the command you previously assigned to one of your battling sprites, the performance enhancement would still be registered. And just because you got more hit points for getting hit by the enemy, that didn't mean that your own party members couldn't fulfill that role as well. Careful and patient players could level up their party significantly in just one battle, by attacking one another or reissuing multiple commands. The walls that blocked your party from the on-screen enemies came crumbling down to create a wide-open combat window with all the necessary information at the bottom. This housed current and max HP, which could now be raised well over 999 points. Final Fantasy II also fashioned a new style of questing and story progression, which involved memorizing key terms from NPC dialogues that would be brought up in later conversations. It was a process that involved lots of unpredictable inspection and time-consuming bouts of trial and error going through the conversation trees. Mechanical and heavily scripted as it may have been, this new way of playing introduced a higher degree of hands-on interactivity that allowed players to be socially immersed in the game's world. The fresh but flawed experience method and question-answer plot progression were just two of many additions to the sequel. While these didn't return in later games, the following developments became standards within the franchise. Final Fantasy II was the first time you could fight with less than 4 members in your party, and have characters come and go throughout the story, including the White Wizard Minwu, the passive General Gordon, the family man/pugilist Joseph, the spunky pirate Leela, and the wyvern-wielding Ricard, the Last Dragoon. Boat and airship rides began on a predetermined path, until you were able to control each craft by yourself, and you were no longer required to dock boats at harbors to reach the mainland. Added to the fleet in the second game was the Snowmobile, a 3-wheeled sailing vessel that allowed you to cross an epic mass of ice. If they were lucky enough, players could stumble upon a stable hidden in a forest, housing a familiar Final Fantasy staple, the Chocobo. It was Final Fantasy II that introduced the world to these beaked companions that helped players cross the continent faster with 0 enemy encounters. And you couldn't get in an airship in 2 until you met Sid for the first time. Players would bump into this pilot/scientist/engineer/explorer many times in the years to come, as his namesake continued throughout the main series and beyond. Sid taxied you around the map and eventually gave you his pride and joy to use at your leisure. Final Fantasy II's story was much more involved than the tale that was told before it. The characters had preset relationships, and several heroes passed on or blinked away, sacrificing themselves for the greater good. In total, 6 good guys died before the story was over. The plot strangely mirrored that of Star Wars Episode IV, involving young heroes joining a rebellion. The Empire imposed its will using a giant metal ship, with a distraught princess tucked inside. Final Fantasy II almost made its way to the States in 1990 under the subtitle Dark Shadow over Palakia, but it was cancelled due to development time and the release of the Super Nintendo. US audiences would have to wait until 2003 to play Final Fantasy II when it was reinvented, along with its predecessor, for consoles, handhelds, and mobile phones around the world. Final Fantasy II was the first sequel in the industry not to feature any characters or locations from the game that preceded it. It turned the unexpected RPG series into a bona fide franchise, and left Japanese gamers waiting for 16 months to play the next sequel. American gamers didn't get to play it until last year. Final Fantasy III was released in Japan on April 27, 1990, and was once again forged by the team that created the series. It began with an earthquake opening up a hidden cavern entrance on a floating island near the village of Ur. 4 orphaned youngsters disguised as Onion Knights left their guardian in search of the altar cave. Within it, they discovered the Wind Crystal. The crystal bestowed upon them jobs, a Final Fantasy tradition. Instead of choosing one class, or having the story do it for you, FF3 let you switch between multiple professions, including newcomers Archer, Scholar, Geomancer, Viking, Magic Knight, Bard, and Sage. All carried specific weapons and armor, and more were unlocked when each new crystal was found. Each job had its own special skill, and Final Fantasy III opened up a new space in your battle menu to include it. This gave thieves the ability to steal, and dragoons the opportunity to jump. But no matter the job, they all leveled up the same way, as the experience point system returned from the first game. Two of the more significant new jobs were Conjurer and Summoner. Both of them were able to bring forth magical beings for the first time in the series. These summons, like Odin, Ramu, Shiva, Ifrit, Titan, and Leviathan, could be purchased in stores or obtained by defeating the powerful creatures themselves. They played no role in the actual storyline, but their additional firepower was definitely welcome. Just as the second chapter introduced Chocobos, the third forced you to meet Moogles, cute, fuzzy little bat-winged bear monsters that guarded the reclusive wizard Doga. The Moogle would become a series staple, selling you magic, fighting alongside your party, and keeping your online house in order. To lighten up the early game's inventory limitations, 3 fed their bird runners a little too much grain and produced fat chocobos, plump creatures that could swallow items and transport heavy loads across the map. A submarine and several new types of airships were introduced in 3, including the Nautilus, Enterprise, and the Invincible, a warship that could be explored like a castle, complete with shops and private quarters. Cid helped you tour the skies once again, and even followed your party around for a while once you freed him from the ghost town of Kazis. The forgetful warrior Desh hitched up with your crew after he gave you mini-magic, the ability to shrink your entire party and enter several mouse-sized areas. The story placed the 4 orphaned heroes in an eternal struggle between the forces of light and darkness. When one was disrupted, the other would call on 4 warriors to reset the fragile equilibrium. Ages ago, foolish mortals attempted to absorb the power of light, calling forth dark warriors to fight back. The Gulgans, a circle of blind prophets, predicted that one day the reverse would occur, and these light warriors would hopefully restore the balance for good. These events came to pass thanks to a spiteful mage named Zand, a pupil of the wizard Noah, and a sentient being called the Cloud of Darkness, a hive mind of evil that aimed to tip the world off kilter while an unstoppable void consumed it. Final Fantasy III was unfortunately shadowed by the release of 6 in America 4 years later. The 6th installment was renamed 3 as it was the 3rd Final Fantasy released in the US. This almost erased all knowledge in the States of the 3rd Famicom game, and meant we wouldn't get our hands on it until it was ported to the Nintendo DS 16 years later. The 3rd Final Fantasy was a huge adventure, definitely the biggest RPG Square had made so far. It brought the most successful elements of the first 2 games together, and helped build a growing curiosity as the series would soon have to move ahead a generation. But before it made the jump, it met another proud landmark in its 20-year history. On July 12, 1990, 2 months after Final Fantasy III came out in Japan, the original Fantasy was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in America, and a legion of English-speaking gamers boarded an airship ride into the future of role-playing. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. This was 2 months before Final Fantasy II was released in Japan, and 2 years before most Americans would know the series even existed. 16-bit adventures for Sega's new system, like Phantasy Star 2 and Sword of Vermilion, made NES owners think about the future. The Super Famicom didn't arrive in Japan until November 11, 1990. It handled thousands of colors, dozens of sprites on screen, and 8 channels of sampled sound in full stereo. Backgrounds came to life thanks to Mode 7, which allowed layers to be scaled and rotated. It also supported 4 megabyte storage units, so anyone inclined to make a role-playing game with this technology could potentially squeeze 40 to 50 hours of gameplay into one plastic cartridge. The Super versions of the NES and Famicom hit the market running thanks to their epic fanbase and solid relationships with third-party developers, including Square. A 4th Fantasy was inevitable. Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan on July 19, 1991.
For the first time, it also came out in America the same year. It was renamed Final Fantasy II in the States, and with most US gamers absent-mindedly skipping over 2 entries in the franchise, it was considered a phenomenal leap forward. 4 was once again directed by Sakaguchi, designed by Amano, and composed by Uematsu. Final Fantasy IV had a unique protagonist, straying from the series' tendency to place massive burdens on heroes with little to no combat experience. 4's heavily conflicted leading man was Cecil, a Dark Knight of the Kingdom of Baron and commander of the monarchy's airship fleet called the Red Wings. After questioning the king's request to attack innocent people in the search of 4 crystals, Cecil was stripped of his rank and forced to reevaluate his ambitions. He was aided on his path of redemption by his dragoon companion Kain, his white mage lover Rosa, the lost summoner Rydia, and many others. Final Fantasy IV removed the interchangeable job system from the previous game to focus on the characters, similar to the plot-driven party swapping from 2. Jobs were already assigned and oftentimes related to the plot. Spells and summons were now learned by levels, through specific battle criteria or in accordance with the story. You never knew what crew you were going to end up with, but the arrangements were given a boost by allowing an extra character, making the battle line built for 5, for the first and only time. Telepathic hypnosis played a big factor in characters leaving your group. Once Cecil had left his kingdom behind, the warrior Golbez took control of the Red Wings and the will of Kain. The karate master Yang also briefly fell victim to mind manipulation, and both of your friends had to be smacked around before they eventually snapped out of it. These additional characters didn't just follow, they fought, and sometimes died alongside you. Your ranks gained the abilities of Tella, the vengeful mage, Edward, the pensive bard, Palom and Porum, a precocious pair of young mages, Edge, an impulsive prince, and Fusoya, a resident of the moon with many buried secrets to tell. Even the Tinkerer Cid grabbed a club and finally took matters into his own hands. It's also worth noting that Rydia is one of the only characters in the entire franchise that goes through a permanent physical transformation. She left your party unexpectedly and resurfaced in the Land of Summons, where time moved faster. She dropped her ability to perform white magic, but gained several new spells, her full summoning potential, and a matured character sprite. 4's biggest technical influence on the rest of the series was the introduction of the active time battle system created by Hiroyuki Ito. With it, adversaries don't wait patiently for players to input actions. Instead, each enemy and character gets a turn every few seconds, with players forced to act quickly if they want to finish the battle with minimal damage. The system made combat a bit livelier, allowing for more engrossing gameplay. The battle screens added unique terrain layouts underneath their heroes and enemies. The environments, characters, monsters, and bosses all received a significant improvement in detail. Group spells all animated at the same time. Smoke and fog was now transparent. Square clearly proved that Final Fantasy IV could not have been done on the 8-bit Nintendo. You could even adjust the color of the menus. While previous fantasies typically had just the planet's surface to explore, 4 added 2 free-roaming maps, the Underworld and the surface of the Moon. Your flying machines were fashioned with accessories to help you get to these new places. The Lunar Whale was resurrected to help you reach the stars, and black chocobos were introduced that could fly but only land in forests. All of Nobuo Uematsu's scores have been exceptional for their era, but Final Fantasy IV was the first noticeable example of the melodic subtleties and enduring themes that his work has gradually become famous for. Theme of Love has been taught to Japanese school children as part of their curriculum. The tracks from 4 have appeared on several compilation albums and have been performed live by numerous orchestras and metal bands. The story in 4 rekindled the 4-tier elemental structure, and even referred to the monsters as fiends. Mylon, Kainazo, Valvalis, and Rubicant weren't the original names, but their inclusion was a nod to the first game. Summons were also given peculiar names, as 4 first introduced Americans to the advanced magic. Shiva, Odin, and Bahamut kept their names throughout the series, but Americans first knew Ifrit and Ramu as Jinn and Indra. One of the towns in 4 began a Final Fantasy tradition of names reappearing in later games, as Mysidia, originally from Final Fantasy II, returns as a homey mage village. 4 made several direct references to our universe as well. It was the first fantasy to name its world, as Fusoya refers to it as the Blue Planet. He explains that he and the rest of his race, called the Lunarians, originally came from a planet in between Mars and Jupiter. Fusoya also revealed that Golbez was not their ultimate enemy, as he was also being brainwashed by another Lunarian named Zemus. Eventually Zemus revealed his true form, but with the help of some well wishes from home, Cecil and company found the strength to overcome the overgrown evil. IV was the first Final Fantasy and one of the first RPGs to have multiple characters with their own deep, intertwining stories and affecting relationships. It was the first to link two heroes together romantically, a device the later Final Fantasies would hinge entire plotlines on. Some criticisms were raised regarding the spotty English translation, but even those little quirks are recalled with fond memories by longtime fans. The script and the graphics would be continually revised as 4 was ported to the PlayStation, WonderSwan Color, and Game Boy Advance, and it's scheduled to be released in 3D on the Nintendo DS sometime before the end of 2007. 4 has sold close to 3 million copies across all its systems, but it was not an immediate hit. Whether it was because of 4's international sales numbers, Nintendo's tentative relationship with Square, or the time and resource-consuming task of translating one massive game after another, the next title was for the third time in the franchise, only released in Japan. Despite thousands of American gamers suddenly discovering the role-playing series, the fifth installment wouldn't make it to US shores until the end of the decade. Final Fantasy V was released on December 6, 1992. The now infamous creative team returned for the fifth time, and Tetsuya Nomura was added to the group as a monster designer. Nomura would go on to design the characters for 7, 8, 10, 10-2, and Direct Advent Children. 5's opening broke the mold by having the 4 main characters meet each other for the very first time. Born to be a wanderer, the hero Bartz sees a meteor fall while camping out with his chocobo, Boko, and the two run to the site of the crash. There, they met Lena, the Princess of Tycoon, and Galef, one of the oldest central characters in any Final Fantasy, whose memory was recently knocked out of his mind. Crystals returned as the core theme of the story, but this time they directly affected the world around them, other than just threatening to destroy it. When the wind crystal shattered, the wind stopped blowing, making it nearly impossible to travel by sea, and so on. The quest set you in search of the whereabouts of King Tycoon, the identity of Galef, and the evil behind it all. 5 returned to the multiple job structure from 3, but with a new refined system, also created by Hiroyuki Ito. Ability points were gained once you received your first handful of jobs, so you leveled your jobs and characters separately. When each new level was reached, you got a new ability, and you could then assign one as a sub-ability to another job. This was the series' first attempt at multi-classing. The brand new classes including Blue Mage, Berserker, Sorcerer, Time Mage, Trainer, Samurai, Dancer, Chemist, and Mime created even more advanced abilities that would reappear in the sequels to come. Blue Mages brought their enemy skill-based power to the party. Samurais tossed Gil, and Mimes could mimic the commands of others as well as assign up to 3 sub-abilities. Thieves could now dash, a time-saving talent that would be added automatically to the ports by pressing the B button. Multi-classing was highly functional, but it was also rewarding because it offered you the chance to change your physical appearance at will for the first time in the franchise. There were a total of 110 different costumes, as each character looked different when they assumed each job. Cid helped you get back above the clouds, but this time he was assisted by his grandson Mid. The two busy workers turned your airship into a 3-part flying machine, boat, and submarine to glide across all 3 planes of the planet. But their planet wasn't the only one they explored. Their primary adversary, Exdeath, revealed himself shortly before Galef began to recall his memories. Galef remembered he was in fact royalty from another world, and had a granddaughter named Kryl. When Exdeath was first released, Galef was one of the 4 original Warriors of Dawn that stood up to oppose him. One of Exdeath's henchmen, Gilgamesh, made his first Final Fantasy cameo in 5. and would return as a flamboyant adventurer in the 2D and 3D journeys to follow. Exdeath's aim was to harness a void locked inside the rift between the two worlds that was created when they were magically ripped apart. To force the two dimensions together, he stole 4 crystals from a sacred tree, keeping the balance in place. And it seemed all hope was lost for the new Warriors of Dawn. It was then that Galuf made it to his feet and made franchise history. Before Eris, Galuf was the first long-term party member to die in the line of duty. The loss was a shock, considering you were well over halfway through the story, but all your hard work spent honing his abilities didn't go to waste. Galuf transferred all he knew to Kryl, and she filled his space in the battle queue. A visit to the Turtle Sage Guild revealed the existence of 12 legendary weapons, sacred items destined for the jobs they were created for. With these tools in tow, the newly assembled foursome crossed into the rift and faced Exdeath right as he merged with the void itself. For the first time, there were multiple endings triggered by whoever was or wasn't standing in your party when Exdeath's final form was defeated. Final Fantasy V was supposed to be Final Fantasy III in America, but the first localization was cancelled. It was then rumored to be released as Final Fantasy Extreme, but plans for that project also fell through. Even a third attempt was launched and crushed to bring 5 to PCs by developer Top Dog Software. These failed attempts aggravated gamers so much, 5 became one of the first titles to receive a fan translation, and until 1998, they were the only ways you could play it. Eventually 5 re-emerged on the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance with updated cinemas and new jobs to try on. It was then that American gamers could finally experience the intricate job system that would leave undeniable traces on the rest of the franchise. How do you animate something 26 pixels tall? How can a character with barely enough room to blink exude emotion? From the tight restrictions on how many sprites could fill the screen to how much text could fit in each blue rectangular bubble, there were multiple challenges that Square was faced with when developing the first 6 Final Fantasies. The original Famicom battle sprites were 26 pixels in height, had only 4 different colors to compose their blocky likeness, and 6 different frames of animation. The Super Famicom characters were a few pixels smaller, but flaunted 11 different colors that drastically improved their individual wardrobe options, and performed up to 40 unique frames of animation, conveying feelings of sadness, anger, doubt, surprise, and joy. In Final Fantasy I, characters would roam aimlessly around each town, or stand and wait for you to engage them in conversation. Whenever additional movement was implied, they would vanish. In Final Fantasy II, characters began to walk along scripted paths, oftentimes when entering or exiting a room. This scene from 2, where Paul rescues your party from imprisonment, is one of the first clear examples of Square trying out comical sprite choreography. These scenarios would become much more elaborate, often involving the tiny actors jumping and throwing themselves around when the paltry 30 pixels used to create their faces couldn't communicate their excitement or frustration. It was this careful attention to expression that made the personalities in each Final Fantasy so charming, and the events so surprisingly engaging. In the first 5 games, there were separate sprites for the models in combat and on the overworld, a smaller one on the map, and a larger, more detailed one in battle. But the 6th chapter in Final Fantasy used the higher resolution hero for both, adding about 10 different animations per character. Even minor movements like the wink of an eye or the wag of a finger drew layers of subtle inflections onto each scene. Best of all, the multiple NPCs you encountered grew up in stature as well. By the mid-90s, Square was ready to showcase the aptitude of their tiny thespians in one final 16-bit performance. Final Fantasy VI was released in Japan on April 2, 1994, and in America the following October. It showed up in the States as Final Fantasy III, and was the last title to be renumbered as it crossed shores. Yoshitaka Amano continued his work as the series' character designer, and Nobuo Uematsu wrote his most extensive score yet for the 6th installment. For the first time, Hironobu Sakaguchi did not direct, but produced the game and developed the concept. His former duties were split between series innovator Hiroyuki Ito and designer and writer Yoshinori Kitase. Kitase had worked with Squaresoft on Romancing Saga and the Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, but 6 was his directorial debut. He would go on to direct Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VIII. 6 opened with an unnamed soldier who is still the only focal female protagonist to begin a Final Fantasy game. Her name was Terra, and that was about all she could remember. Hunted by yet another oppressive tyrannical government and possessing forbidden magical powers she could not comprehend, Terra sought refuge with the Returners, a renegade group secretly gathering their forces for an attack against Emperor Gestal. 1,000 years prior, a conflict called the War of the Magi almost destroyed the world, and society struggled to regain technology. The fight began when humans were tempted to harness the power of mystical beings called Espers, and it appeared the Empire was after the same goal, moving dangerously close to repeating another senseless and deadly mistake. Espers were the first names clearly bestowed upon summons, and a third ingenious system created by Hiroyuki Ito. Humans could only learn their power when the beasts expired into crystallized forms called magicite. Similar to the ability points from 5, winning battles in 6 awarded characters with magic points. When an Esper was assigned to one of your characters, these points would be added to the spells that Esper could teach you, and you would learn them at the percentage rate indicated. Some taught spells faster than others, and some taught just one exclusively. This meant that anyone could learn any spell, and use them at any time. The Empire's savage lust for the Esper's power, which forced the creatures into exile, combined with sacrificing their lives to assist you in your journey, gave summons a more important role in the central quest than ever before. The other element that contributed to the epic story was the astounding number of playable characters. 6 didn't let you assign jobs, just as 4 had removed the prior class system to concentrate on a series of elaborate plotlines. While 5 had 22 jobs, 6 eventually offered 14 characters you could swap out anytime to create your own party. Occasionally, the story filled in a few necessary spaces for certain scenes, but most of the time, all 4 roles were yours to cast. Your warriors could be customized even further by equipping up to 2 relics, trinkets that awarded various bonuses similar to the sub-abilities from 5. All this party customization made you that much more attached to whoever you chose each time the order opened up. At 2 points throughout the narrative, you were required to split up your available forces into 3 parties, and command them all simultaneously against several meandering enemy groups. If one of them got past you to your end zone of the battlefield, the skirmish would be lost. In 2 certain dungeons, including the one that leads to the finale, you had to direct separate groups working back and forth to assist one another. And at one pivotal junction, the story split you into 3 teams with alternate destinations, and you got to choose your own adventure. The Returners' front lines were made up of Locke, a thief, Edgar, the young king of Figaro, Sabin, his twin brother, Celes, a former Imperial general, Setzer, a gambler and airship pilot, Cyan, a tortured warrior, Gao, a lost feral child, Strago, an elder mage knight, Realm, his rambunctious granddaughter, and Shadow, a ninja with a foggy past that's never completely revealed. Each character had its own signature talent and piece of the plot puzzle. Edgar used tools. Sabin performed Street Fighter-style button commands called blitzes. Celes wielded a runic blade that absorbed magical attacks. Cyan counted upwards through different sword skills. Gao imitated monsters. Setzer pulled a lever on an attack-initiating slot machine, and so on. At least one segment of the game was devoted to revealing fragments from each of the characters' backstories, and some of them were more thought-provoking and heartbreaking than the events that made up the main mission. The only returners that were primed solely for battle, aside from cameos that would drop in and out of your party, were 3 optional recruits near the end of the game: the Moogle Mog, the Yeti Umaro, and the mysterious mimic Gogo, who also made a shrouded appearance in Final Fantasy V. Sid stayed out of the party in 6, merely helping you when he could. As a scientist in the Empire's Magitech facility, he had nothing to do with airships for the first time. All of these leading players were almost overshadowed by one of the gaudiest villains the series has ever feared. Kefka, Emperor Gestal's ambassador, was a nasty clown that demanded a great deal of attention. He was among the first faces to appear on the screen, and the first character to utter a spoken line of dialogue, even if it was just a trademark cackle. Kefka was not a supernatural being, or the collected sum of all evil, or a mind-warping god from another planet. He was a man, albeit a twisted soul, who sought supreme power above all else. He wasn't a puppet to a higher power, or a victim seeking revenge. He was just an awful human being, and a wonderful bad guy. But creating the characters wasn't enough. They acted and animated in ways the series had never attempted before. The fourth wall of the battle screen was obliterated, with interactive scenes often playing themselves out from the combat view. Instances where multiple characters were animated at once were now commonplace, instead of being reserved for towns or major plot moments. The best example of this, and the scene that stole the show, quite literally in 6, was an opera the player had to actively participate in by remembering their lines and blocking. This story within a story within a story shows how elegantly each event played out in 6, and why most of its moments are eternally unforgettable. With Sid working for the Empire, the High Roller Setzer allowed you to borrow the only airship in the world. When that craft crashed and burned, he dug up another that belonged to a lost friend. You could be taxied by boat on occasion, but there were no canoes, snowmobiles, or submarines in 6, just the 2 flying machines. But your point of view while controlling them was drastically different. Instead of being stuck to one altitude and forced to travel in 4 directions, you had 360 degrees of movement, along with the ability to climb and dive through the air. A brand new mini-map in the lower right kept you from getting lost, which was easy to do with the extreme speeds of the new crafts. This new beveled angle was also applied to Chocobo runs, which showed your character on birdback from a lowered perspective. The Second War of the Magi led both sides to the Sealed Gate, the border between their world and the land the Espers had originally escaped to. Coming in contact with their kind revealed that Terra was neither an Esper nor a human, but a product of both. Proof that the 2 races could coexist, she rallied the Returners until they were forced to stop Kefka from disturbing 3 statues that created magic itself ages ago. But they were too late. Forced to flee the unnatural floating island, they boarded their airship just in time to see it torn in 2. The entire army was scattered, their fates unknown, and the planet was changed forever. Waking up in the shoes of Celas, on the shores of a deserted island, players had to explore this brand new planet of scorched earth, reassemble their ranks soldier by soldier, and reach a looming tower for the game's final confrontation. At SIGGRAPH in 1995, Locke, Terra, and Shadow made a command performance in a 3D minigame created by Square, using prototype Nintendo 64 workstations from Silicon Graphics. The technical demonstration was completely playable, with patterns made by a computer mouse initiating attack commands. It served to teach Square's artists how to render sprites in 3D, and show the eager public what they had in store for the first 3D Final Fantasy. FF6 was also ported to the PlayStation in 1999 and the Game Boy Advance in early 2007. Final Fantasy VI was an extraordinary way for the series to bow out of the second dimension. Its artfully crafted storyline and meaningful characters made the final chapter in the Nintendo saga feel as if all the other adventures had been building up to its creation. Its 20-minute ending is one of the longest on the platform, and as the last page in its book was turned, it was clear that 6 would be one tough fantasy to follow. From the way it capitalized on the full potential of the Super Nintendo, to the acclaim it received, Final Fantasy VI's visual flair primed the series for the generation to follow. and it would never have to hide its true Roman numerals again. Development for the seventh Final Fantasy began in 1995, 1 year after the release of 6. Square had been experimenting with the idea of a 3D RPG ever since 5 was released on the Super Famicom, and the demo with SIGGRAPH showed Square could shift its style forward a dimension. It just didn't reveal how. Nintendo's next-generation machine would be cartridge-based, and while its 64-bit system would be the most powerful on the market, cartridges with a great deal of memory were incredibly expensive to produce. Looking at its finances and the concepts it was cooking for the next Final Fantasy, Square was forced to make a difficult decision. Saying goodbye to their sprites, and Nintendo, which had provided 2 generations of hardware for Square to revive itself with, the company announced on January 12, 1996, the series would continue exclusively on the Sony PlayStation. Square wouldn't release another game for a Nintendo console until Crystal Chronicles for the GameCube, 7 years later. The team Square assembled to tackle the project was 100 strong, one of the largest ever devoted to a single game's development. They had a budget of $45 million and cutting-edge film production tools like Power Animator and Soft Image 3D. Sony launched a $100 million advertising campaign to bring anticipation to a boil. Due to its extraordinary goals, the game's release date was pushed back almost a full year. On a new console with new technology and a concept that was a far cry from the themes its fans had grown to love, Square wasn't too far from where it had been almost 10 years earlier. Its next game would either boost it to superstardom or summon the imminent doom of the company. Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan on January 31, 1997, and American gamers had to go on hearing how amazing it was for another 9 months. Hironobu Sakaguchi remained at the helm, maintaining a lead production role. Yoshinori Kitase continued on from 6 to direct, and series veterans Yoshitaka Amano and Nobuo Uematsu returned to their usual duties. Kazushige Nojima assisted Sakaguchi and Kitase with the writing, and Tetsuya Nomura, who joined the team for 5, designed the characters for the first time. His manga style was deemed more compatible with the basic 3D structure of the game. While previous fantasies had you gradually enlist in forces struggling to save the world, 7 rushed you right into battle with the resistance group on a mission to destroy a toxic reactor. The self-absorbed swordsman Cloud Strife initially had little interest in joining the rebels, but if the pay was right, he was willing to hang around. A monopolizing megacorporation called the Shinra Electric Power Company was slowly sucking the life out of the planet, and freedom fighters known as Avalanche were the only ones willing to fight back. As an ex-member of Soldier, Shinra's squad of genetically enhanced elite warriors, Cloud was stuck fighting for the good guys whether he liked it or not. He was asked to sign up by his childhood friend Tifa, and bossed around by its outspoken leader Barrett. The small resistance army would grow to include the wild experiment Red 13, the bubbly thief Yuffie, the feline puppet Kate Sith, the shadowy gunfighter Vincent, and after rescuing her from Shinra headquarters, the spiritually serene Eris. For the most part, the game shared a point of view similar to PlayStation predecessor Resident Evil. There was a fixed camera and pre-rendered backgrounds. Polygonal characters moved where the environment would let them. One of Sakaguchi's main concerns with continuity was the moments between these scenes. In an attempt to cover loading times, many animations or short in-game cinemas were implemented. This began the time-honored tradition of the Final Fantasy in-game cutscene. Final Fantasy VII employed over 40 minutes of full-motion wonder, the most impressive use of video as a gaming tool for its time. In addition, there were a number of cinematic transitions which used the same models and backgrounds in the game that seamlessly blended them into the action. The battle window also gained cinematic enhancements. The camera was almost constantly moving, highlighting magic spells, special abilities, and enemy attacks. These smooth perspective patterns were also random, ensuring you rarely saw the same angle twice in one fight. The sequences that did repeat were the elaborate summons. Some of them were close to a minute in length. Your party size was cut down to 3, forcing you to simplify your attack strategies. You also only had 3 items to equip in your inventory: a weapon, armor, and an accessory. This appeared quite restrictive at first, until Barrett revealed the game's ability system, called Materia. These colorful orbs were formed out of crystallized Mako, the blood pumping in the planet's veins, called the life stream, and the source of the world's power. Possessing a piece of materia made you spiritually linked to the planet's spirit, and the memories of those who had returned to its source after death. This connection gave you numerous spells and bonuses, similar to espers and relics combined. But you didn't learn these skills, each materia did, and when you swapped their assignments, the experience level traveled with them. Materia leveled on ability points after each battle, and characters got more materia slots as their weapons and armor improved. Job-specific battle behaviors like covering, stealing, and casting spells on multiple targets were now assigned to specific materia. Along with being spiritual power generators, the orbs gave you stat bonuses reflective of their abilities. Like espers, materia also played a major role in the story, as white and black materia became pivotal to the balance of the planet. Black materia cast meteor, to which the only defense was holy, which required white materia. Both these spells had made prior appearances in Final Fantasy, but never had they affected the world so significantly. When your party was pushed to the brink, a new bar began flashing next to their active time battle indicator. When they received damage, it filled up, and at its peak, the attack option was replaced with character-specific limit breaks. You couldn't choose from the whole list, though, and had to assign which of the 4 groups to bring into the fray. You could unleash them the second they were earned, or save them for another battle. Sid hopped back in the pilot seat in 7 as an aggressive aeronaut with dreams of traveling into outer space. His attitude and style was reminiscent of the character's first appearance in 2, and a departure from the older, bearded design gamers had met in 3, 4, and 5. He donated the tiny Bronco, a small craft that doubled as a boat after it was shot down. He also welcomed you aboard his Lady Luck, the Highwind, which shared his last name. He took up a lance and aided you in battle for the second time in the series, sharing his pedigree and many abilities with the Dragoon Cane from Final Fantasy IV. Chocobos chirped you across the landscape, but you had to call them by equipping the Chocobo lure materia to bring them into battle. You could then race your newfound pets by entering them in speedways at the Golden Saucer. After you won your first Choco Chase, the manager Dio gave you a land-roving buggy that was open to enemy attacks, but chugged over rivers and deserts. The saucer was like Pleasure Island, with several interactive minigames requiring dexterous button selecting. These time trials also emerged in the story, making pivotal moments tense with the fear of getting one step behind. They also ensured the following games would have an equal amount or more of playful diversions that could absorb your time when you weren't worrying about the end of the world. 7 dealt with surprisingly mature subject matter, from an inclusion of cross-dressing as a mission objective to an open reference to prostitution. Barrett was the first leader bold enough to utter several obscenities, and the only central black character in the entire franchise. It was also the first entry to show blood. They say the mettle of a man is tested in adversities, and anyone who would dare stand against Sephiroth would find out immediately what they were made of. Therefore, it's ironic that Cloud didn't realize who he really was. Sephiroth was the strongest soldier alive, but wouldn't rest until he controlled the planet. He sought to bring Meteor down to the surface, tearing a wound so deep that the life stream would emerge to cleanse it. There he would join with it, becoming a god with the planet's pulse at his fingertips. Aeris also rediscovered her identity as a direct descendant of the Cetra, or Ancients, a race that nearly vanished thousands of years ago. They were run off their homeworld by Genova, a vampiric alien lifeform that crash-landed in a meteor long before anyone could remember. Cloud's feelings were split between Aeris and longtime pal Tifa, as the story had 2 female leads seeking affections for the first time. You could choose who to court and who to ignore, but it wouldn't matter. At GDC in 2004, Steven Spielberg said, "I think the real indicator that games have become a storytelling art form will be when somebody confesses that they cried at level 17. He never played Final Fantasy VII. The grand story in 7 was a compilation of a number of inspirations. With the release of Final Fantasy VI, Sakaguchi was faced with the death of his mother. Wrestling with grief led him to develop a number of the concepts in 7, such as Genova. Further depth was drawn from religious beliefs that center on rebirth, or the cycling of souls back to a great mystical body, most apparent in the Lifestream. The name Sephiroth also comes from the mythology of the Kabbalah, referring to spiritual manifestations of the 10 heavenly attributes. Final Fantasy VII was a marvel of technology and a commanding display of limitless imagination. The only thing that lessened its impact was that, were it not for Ifrit, Shiva, and Chocobo riding Moogles, the game was almost unrecognizable as a Final Fantasy title. The series went from being classically medieval to ambiguously futuristic. Castles became skyscrapers, wyverns became helicopters, minecarts became motorcycles, and bows became machine guns. While fans will eternally debate which Final Fantasy is the best, no one can argue that 7 is the most popular, or the one that left the largest stamp on the industry. It was the first Final Fantasy to be released on the PC. The snowboarding minigame was ported to mobile phones in 2005, and in 1998, Cloud, Tifa, Sephiroth, Yuffie, Vincent, and Zack all appeared as playable combatants in the fighting game Airgee's God Bless the Ring. Their inclusion led many to call the PlayStation release the Final Fantasy Fighter. Shortly after the turn of the century, Nomura and Kitase were approached to create a polymorphic project that could expand one of the Final Fantasy games across multiple mediums, in an effort to prove the franchise was capable of breaking out of its Roman numeral namesake. Kitase immediately suggested 7 as the perfect candidate, because its ending left numerous avenues open for the story to continue. The project was called Compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Its ongoing catalog includes Before Crisis, a prequel to 7 focusing on the Turks, Shinra's version of the CIA. The turn-based adventure storyline follows the Shinra investigators as they fight the precursor to the Avalanche introduced in 7. The mobile phone exclusive series ran for 25 episodes in Japan, and the last entry was released on April 1st, 2006. A PSP game was also introduced called Crisis Core, which stars 7's underappreciated hero Zack, Cloud's savior and Aeris's former boyfriend. But the first video game to hit stores under the compilation umbrella came from an unexpected genre, the shooter. Combining a first-person perspective with the back-flipping melee action of Devil May Cry, the last chapter in the saga of Midgar focused on the unfinished business of Vincent Valentine. Dirge of Cerberus was released in Japan on January 26, 2006. Cerberus had Vincent facing off against an army of rogue soldiers called Deep Ground, whose intent was to call forth Omega and end the world. Every living thing eventually returned to the Lifestream, and Omega was the entity that would one day collect all the energy and return it to the stars, leaving the planet as a crumbling rock disintegrating into space. Despite Vincent's obvious ease at using Cerberus and dodging enemy fire with flare, the gameplay in Dirge was admittedly constrictive. This was apparent due to several changes made to the game before its US release 7 months later. Dirge had a mobile add-on called Lost Episode, released on August 18, 2006. And then there's the infamous trailer shown during the Sony press conference at E3 2005 that teased millions by demonstrating what Final Fantasy VII would look like if it was recreated for the PlayStation 3. Although it was solely intended to act as a technical demonstration, many fans mistook it, and still do, as a trailer for a forthcoming rebirth of the PlayStation Classic. Even if the game never returns, the universe of Final Fantasy VII continues to expand. The fan community on both coasts has continually called out 7 as one of the best video games ever created. At a financial results conference in 2006, Square Enix president Yoichi Wada claimed the compilation of Final Fantasy VII would be around for another 10 years, which would end the celebration on its 20th anniversary. Squaresoft's foray into the CD-based era was a veritable success. Final Fantasy VII shattered sales records on both coasts, selling an astounding 2.3 million copies within 3 days of its Japanese release, and an additional 330,000 later that year in America. For the first time ever, Final Fantasy was a mainstream fixture in the gaming world. VII's departure from the series' signature conventions was originally perceived as risque. The game skated between elements of the past and present with adventurous new changes in system mechanics and story direction. In the end, those very tweaks were paramount to VII's success. When Square knew it had a hit on its hands, the company began production on number 8 the very same year, during VII's localization in the US. The series had to evolve even further, like no other in the franchise. Final Fantasy VIII was released in Japan on February 11, 1999, September 7th in the States. Development had run continuously for nearly 2 years. Sakaguchi graced the project once more as the executive producer, while Kitase, Nomura, and Uematsu reprised their respective roles. The experience that Square gained during the production of VII bolstered its understanding of the PlayStation hardware's capabilities. With this knowledge in hand, Kitase envisioned the next game sporting a more realistic look, and with Nomura's encouragement, a school-days aesthetic similar to popular Japanese dramas and animes airing at the time. With this came realistically proportioned character models, the first the series had ever seen. And the ballad of Squall Leonhardt and Renoa Hartley. Final Fantasies typically put you in the company of rogues, rebels, and mercenaries, but 8 established players as one of the trainees of Balam Garden, a military academy managed by the watchful eye of Headmaster Sid. Squall, an introverted gunblade specialist, was one of the school's most promising students. On the day of his graduation exam, he was contracted by the state of Delay to repel the forces of the invading Galbadian Empire, along with fellow trainees Zell, a hot-headed brawler, Selphie, a cheerful nunchaku master, Cypher, a rebellious upperclassman, and Quistis, Squall's instructor. Squall's Galbadian encounter was the first of many. He eventually found himself under the commission of Renoa, the spirited leader of an upstart rebellion group. Together, they become inextricably linked to the fate of Galbadia's leader, Sorceress Adia. A later objective called upon Squall and his unit, headlined by the romantic rifleman Irvine, to assassinate the sorceress. But when the plan goes awry, a plentitude of truths open themselves to Squall, prompting him to abandon all preconceived notions of the mission and his duty. A sorceress from the future, Ultimisia, was revealed as the true culprit, manipulating time itself in a bid to unite her dimension with the past. Together with his companions, Squall ventured into the Den of the Lion to restore order to the world and protect the ones dear to his heart. Final Fantasy VIII made bold new strokes in story and narration. The theme of love had always played a part in side stories prior, but for the first time, it was brought into the foreground as the main motivator for the protagonist's actions. It was, for all intents and purposes, a love story, with its cast of characters taking respective roles amid webs of tangled relationships. It was also the first Final Fantasy that delved into different frames of mind, from the internal narrative of Squall's thoughts to a side quest set in a completely different place and time. The realistic tone was made immediately clear by the opening score, an orchestral piece accompanied by a Latin choir and breathtaking full-motion video. Along with the game's title theme song, Eyes on Me, sung by Chinese pop star Fei Wong, 8 was the first of the series to feature lyrical scores. The boundaries that had separated Final Fantasy from other mediums of popular expression, like movies and music, had been broken. Eyes on Me later became a single that went on to sell 400,000 copies in Japan. One of Squall's first outings pitted him against the fiery Ifrit, who wasn't known as a summon or esper, but as a GF, or guardian force. When these magical beasts were bested in combat, they became permanent additions to your party that could be equipped. GFs were powerful allies you could summon in battle, but outside of combat was where they were most useful, in the form of junctioning, the central feature of 8. Rather than pulling on armor with predetermined stats, players could assign magic siphoned from enemies, an action called drawing, and equip them to specific stats and attributes. Junctioning allowed for a great deal of customization and flexibility, bequeathing players all the elemental and status effect spells of the series at their beck and call. Apart from the radical changes in magic and summons, the combat structure, for the most part, resembled the 3-man active time battles from 7. Each of the characters' limit breaks, however, shed 7's limit bar and returned to the rare desperation moves from Final Fantasy VI. Squall, like Cyan before him, pulled off a series of blade strikes timed by the R1 trigger, while Zell utilized the spiritual successor of Sabin's blitz attacks. Weapons were no longer bought, but upgraded, which took various parts collected in battle and used them in a crafting process. In addition, cars, trains, and shuttles comprised a large number of transportation options, although airships, flying fortresses, and the ubiquitous Chocobo also made appearances. The Chocobo was also featured in a minigame tie-in using the Pocket Station. The code to power it still exists in the North American release, but the peripheral never made it across the Pacific. One of Final Fantasy VIII's biggest side features was Triple Triad, a robust minigame that took place on a grid with numbered cards. Though not necessary, it was an interesting and rich diversion that awarded players persistent enough to play it. Determined card sharks could net Squall's legendary weapon, the Lionheart, with enough diligence. Riding the hype of its predecessor, Final Fantasy VIII's release in 1999 beat previous records set with 2.4 million copies sold in Japan, and in America, it became the best-selling game for 3 weeks after its debut in September. Critically, however, the game was received with mixed reactions. Most players and critics felt that the junctioning system was flawed and needlessly complicated, longing for the user-friendliness of 7's materia. Drawing magic from enemies was also cited as a repetitive task. Conversely, some embraced 8's bold system changes. Its storytelling remains amongst the most compelling the series has seen, and its following is one of the largest across the worldwide fanbase. Many speculated the next game in the series would go above and beyond the modern realism of 8 and into the realm of the future. It ultimately became a fond look at the past. As the last Final Fantasy on the original PlayStation, Sakaguchi wanted it to be an adequate reflection on the series thus far. The concept they would end up using wasn't originally intended to be a part of the core franchise. While its early development began alongside 8, the plan was to release the game as an addendum so as not to conflict with the newer futuristic direction the series was heading for. In 1999, it was announced that the yet untitled project would indeed receive a Roman numeral. It was slated to come out in early 2000, but Square's biggest competitor, Enix, had just finished Dragon Quest VII. Square delayed its latest efforts several months to avoid a simultaneous release. They used the time for another marketing push of action figures and Coca-Cola commercials. These showed its next Final Fantasy would be both a striking departure and a faithful homage to the 8 games that preceded it. Final Fantasy IX was released in Japan on July 7, 2000. It arrived in America in mid-November. In addition to his production role, Hironobu Sakaguchi returned to the creative staff to help solidify early concepts. He was aided by game producer Shinji Hashimoto. Yoshitaka Amano also returned to the forefront of the team. Nobuo Uematsu composed his 9th continuous score, and in the director's chair was Hiroyuki Ito, responsible for such Final Fantasy pillars as the Job and Active Time Battle Systems and Espers. Almost every aspect of the design in 9 returned to the roots of the series. The plot appeared to follow many common cliches, but it was intended to. The adventure began when our hero, Zidane, a member of a rogue theater group, took part in an elaborate attempt to kidnap the Princess Garnet. As they bumbled their way through the mission, they were accidentally joined by Garnet's stalwart protector, Steiner, and the befuddled black mage, Vivi. Through the trials that followed, they enlisted the talents of the stoic dragoon Freya, the effervescent summoner Aiko, the enigmatic gourmand Quina, and the brooding bounty hunter Amarant. They also got occasional assistance from Beatrix, a general to the army of Alexandria, and various members of Tantalus, Zidane's performing pals. Cid got promoted to a royal position in 9 as the regent and ruler of Lindblum. He appeared to the party in Oglop form after being cursed by his wife Hilda. Cid revealed he was the one who ordered Tantalus to kidnap the princess to protect her from the unexplained actions of her mother, Queen Braun. The squad engineer helped the party board the Blue Narcissus when both of their airships barely made it back to the ground in one piece. The team took back the skies on Cid's latest invention, the Hildegard III, and even stole the enemy's craft, the Invincible. They also traveled by air trolley and even underground spider in two ancient transit systems called the Gargan and Fossil Rue. The plot in 9 was not only filled with numerous references to the two sprite generations, it almost felt like a direct sequel to the original NES adventure. It was revealed the story's fatalistic villain, Kuja, came from another world called Terra. To reach this dimension and discover its secrets, you had to travel to 4 elemental shrines. Their protectors, Malorus, Tiamat, Kraken, and Lich, are unmistakable allusions to the fiends from Final Fantasy I. Even the time-traveling antagonist from the first game made a comeback, as a Darth Vader-esque Garland was unmasked as the architect of the world's demise. His dreamlike realm was called Pandemonium, which was the Emperor's end zone in Final Fantasy II. Crystals also returned, and their themes were fused with the series' first mention of Gaia as the name of the planet. 9 primarily dealt with its lead characters battling with issues of identity. Garnet had the weight of a kingdom on her inexperienced shoulders, and Vivi came to terms with his own creation and inevitable death. Even Kuja wrestles with intense feelings of powerlessness. In addition to conceptual reference, there are also many specific nods to its predecessors. Hilda bears a resemblance to the Final Fantasy II queen. Dagger dons a white mage's robe, the dwarves shout out a somewhat familiar greeting, the battle line went back to 4, and you could attempt to buy a number of classic trinkets at the Treno auction house, such as Yuna's mirror. The ability system in 9 was considerably streamlined in comparison to the complexities of 8, and reflected the systems Ito had previously implemented. Much like with Espers, characters in 9 learned their abilities by equipping some sort of item that accrued ability points per battle. Once the skills were learned, the item could be swapped out and the character would still be able to use the ability. Any equipment slot now had the capacity to teach these talents, and they became usable by the character the moment the item was assigned. Items taught different characters varied abilities. Much like Final Fantasy IV, each hero in 9 was clearly intended for a particular job. Their personal traits reflected these roles. Some were shared by multiple characters, and some were unique. In addition, not all the abilities could be active at once, allowing the player to be more or less effective by assembling the proper combination of attributes for each upcoming task. The limit break concept from 7 made a comeback when party members entered trance mode by reaching the end of their damage bar. Zidane was the only warrior who could choose from a list of attacks while tranced, as the others received a brief boost, strengthening their attack power or allowing them to act more than once. Unlike limit breaks, these bonuses couldn't be saved and carried over to another encounter. Summons were dubbed Eidolons in 9, and their callers originated from a lost village, similar to Rydia's hometown in 4. Replicating 8's grid-based card diversion, 9 let you challenge multiple characters to a bout of Tetramaster. Unlike 8, the game within a game became a necessary objective that pit you against the sport's champion, Sailor Aeryn. After you became the new Tetramaster, Aeryn was revealed as the pilot of your first airship. 9 also introduced the Final Fantasy audience to a strange internet support system called Play Online. Originally conceived to interact with Final Fantasy X, Play Online developed into an online add-on for Brady Games' strategy guide. This proved to be a poorly thought-out idea. Many fans that purchased it felt cheated because of the lack of printed information. Today, Play Online serves as the communication hub for Square's internet services, including Final Fantasy XI and Tetramaster. Although 9 received critical acclaim, it was faced with mixed feelings from fans. While elder players looked upon it with warm nostalgia, the younger set simply didn't get it. Nevertheless, Sakaguchi has stated several times that Final Fantasy IX is his personal favorite. With Sakaguchi's side project sliding into the 9th slot, the original successor to Final Fantasy VIII was pushed to the PlayStation 2, which launched 3 months before 9 in Japan. Eager to take full advantage of improved technology, Square spent $32 million on its next project, assembling the talents of over 100 writers, coders, and artists. Most of the earlier fantasies focused on a European style of architecture and topography, with 7 and 8 weaving in elements of modern technology and Japanese steampunk. When growing its new world, Square sought influence from the islands of Southeast Asia, specifically near the regions of Thailand and the South Pacific. Water would play a dominant role in the setting and story of Spira, a sun-drenched paradise with beauty gamers had never experienced. Final Fantasy X was released in Japan on July 19, 2001. It washed up on our shores just in time for Christmas. It was directed by Motomu Toriyama, who had worked as an event planner on 7 and 8. Katase and Sakaguchi supervised via producer roles. Tetsuya Nomura returned to design the characters, and Nobuo Uematsu composed his 10th series score, but received additional assistance for the first time. The story began and ended in Zanarkand, a tropic metropolis unaware of its imminent destruction. Titus, a professional blitzball athlete, was barely saved from the massacre by his mentor, Auron. The two warped to the world of Spira, where Titus learned the city he called home had been destroyed 1,000 years earlier. His quest for answers led him to discover an ancient pilgrimage that would shake the ground of his very existence. This fish-out-of-water tale was unconventional for the franchise. As an outsider, Titus learned everything that was known about Spira directly, without any need for creative exposition. The story also stood out by establishing a clear geographic endpoint fairly early on in the narrative, unfolding its secrets as you trekked along the path toward its unavoidable conclusion. This prophetic journey's aim was to guide and protect the summoner Yuna, a caller of sacred spirits now called Aeons, whose power came from human souls called Faith. Yuna's multiple guardians included Waka, a beach-bound blitzball captain, Kimari, a Ronso outcast of few words, Lulu, an unforgiving black mage, and Riku, a spunky teenage thief who was Titus's first contact with Spira. The in-game character models were pleasantly detailed, with facial expressions their predecessors only dreamed of. But their colorful attitudes were defined by another franchise breakthrough:
quiet!
Voice acting.
You have profaned and subverted a 1,000-year-old tradition. Do you realize what you've done?
Their dialogue was penned by Kazushige Nojima, who also wrote Final Fantasy VII and VIII. Not every line was spoken, as subtitles were used for minor non-playable characters, but the central heroes and villains were all cast with both English and Japanese voice actors, bringing their vocal cords to life. The inclusion created numerous development hiccups, such as characters' lips mouthing one language but speaking another.
Take your time.
But the addition was an ambitious and crucial step forward. A priest and maester named Seymour Guado went against the beliefs of his nation and his religion in a quest to save the world from suffering by killing everyone on the planet. To do this, he planned to possess a colossal whale monster named Sin that rose from the depths of the ocean and decimated entire villages. The role of all summoners was to build their strength and family of Aeons to eventually confront Sin in the ruins of Zanarkand. But Sin had and would return multiple times, leaving Titus and his newfound friends to search for a way to end the destructive cycle and abolish Sin once and for all. Cid appeared as Riku's father and the leader of the Al-Bhed, a roguish lower-class race. He gave the party access to the Fahrenheit, only there was no free flying in 10. For the first time, the overworld that had become a series standard vanished, leaving one continuous world map to pass through. While many missed running across open plains and rocketing their ships over oceans and mountains, the alternate perspective needed to disappear so developers could replace another last-generation trick, pre-rendered backgrounds. Every outdoor environment in Final Fantasy X was rendered in real-time 3D, making the gorgeous surroundings stunningly tangible. You had no camera control, but the view would glide along with your movements in numerous directions. Fights were still random while traveling, but many boss encounters began with a flashy transition that blended the angle from the overworld into the brand new battle window. Fights in Final Fantasy X left active time and introduced the conditional turn-based battle. You now had all the time in the world to assign each move, and the order both sides would act in was listed in 8 vertical blocks on the right of the screen. Additionally, a tip ticker scrolled vital information about each target on the top, indicating weaknesses and possible strategies. This had been previously possible as an ability or spell, but never as a tool built into the display. Only 3 people filled the formation, and the other 4 waited in the wings. You could pull them in and out at will, and they gained experience based on their involvement in each bout. If you didn't use them, they didn't level. Overdrives were the new limit break. Like before, they became available when a meter reached its full capacity. Their attacks varied per character, and like Final Fantasy VIII, many required brief bits of timed controller inputs, making use of the PS2's dual analog sticks. The big difference in 10 was the ability to adjust the modes of each character's overdrives, specifically identifying the circumstances that caused the meter to fill. Yuna was the only mage who could use summon magic, and instead of her callings tearing up the battlefield and fading away, they joined the party in exchange for the other 2 members. By your side, they drew the enemy's attacks and acted on a list of available abilities. They had a health meter for the first time, and could fall in battle, only to be resummoned for another fight. 10's leveling system was a labyrinth of attribute plots called the Sphere Grid. As characters powered up, they gained ability points versus experience. When they achieved a new sphere level, they could use any of the glowing orbs they found in their travels by assigning them to any node that opened up. This turned the typically stationary advancement method into a game itself, one that allowed you to go against the grain and adjust anyone's abilities to your liking. Only 2 equipment spaces were allotted to each character, one for weapon, one for armor. But once the crafty Riku joined your party, she could customize your arsenal. Not every item could be upgraded, but the underdeveloped ones gained new abilities and often a new name when you combined them with items like marbles, spheres, and potions. The mandatory minigame in 10 was Tidus and Wakka's favorite pastime, Blitzball, a form of underwater rugby. After a glimpse of the professional sport in one of the opening movies, you went for the championship with the Besaid Aurochs, a good-hearted crew that had lost their first match in the tournament 10 years running. Playing involved both real-time movement and turn-based combat, and once the cup was yours, you could return to the stadium whenever you wanted another challenge. As with many games in the series, Final Fantasy X was adored by some and disliked by others. Fans praised the multifaceted storyline and outstanding graphics. Skeptics detested the flawed sphere system and sometimes unbearable voiceover performances. But rain or shine, few missed out on the series' first installment on Sony's second system. Final Fantasy X sold close to 2 million units in 4 days. It became the first PlayStation 2 game to break that mark, and eventually sold twice that much. It's among the top 20 best-selling console games of all time, and considered one of the best role-playing games on the platform. Square seized this profitable opportunity and finally decided to release a direct sequel to a game in the numbered series. Development began in 2002 with essentially the same design staff, only at 1/3 the size. With the majority of locations and character models being reused from the first game, it took half the time to create. All Final Fantasies have a happy ending, giving 10-2 the most energetic opening fans had ever seen.
What can I do for you?
Final Fantasy X-2 was released in Japan on March 13, 2003, about 2 years after the release of 10. It eventually toured America in November. Since the major crisis in 10 was solved, the atmosphere of the world had a brighter, happier feel. Rather than drawing on reverent Japanese mythology, the team used popular culture, anime, and manga for inspiration. As such, the sound of the game needed to be changed as well. Noriko Matsuda and Takahito Eguchi, known for their work on The Bouncer, took over for Uematsu. X-2 continued the story 2 years later, focusing on Yuna and the Gullwings, a group of ragtag sphere hunters scoring all kinds of adventure in the new, eternally calm Spira. The Gullwings were comprised of many familiar faces from 10, and the crew traveled around the world in Cid's Celsius, making X-2 the first Final Fantasy to give you airship access from the outset. Sharing the field work with Yuna was her boisterous cousin Riku and the stolid newcomer Pain. After continually outsmarting their rivals, the LeBlanc Syndicate, Yuna and the girls eventually stumbled across a sphere that contained some startling information. Unsure if the images were real, the Gullwings set off to uncover the truth and hopefully find Yuna's lost love. Along the way, they encountered many old friends, as well as some eccentric new faces. In the 2 years since Sin was defeated, many new groups had risen to power. Among these, the followers of New Yevon had taken back the holy city of Bavel under the judgment of the Praetor Baralai. The Youth League had rallied many familiar troops behind the banner of the mysterious Maven Nuge, and a charismatic Albed entrepreneur, Gipple, got you started digging in the desert. Although X-2 drew from a number of modern influences, the combat system relied once again on a Final Fantasy classic, job switching. However, jobs were given a fabulous makeover with the addition of dress spheres and garment grids. Garment grids were similar to very small sphere grids with 2 to 6 empty nodes. Dress spheres contained the powers of the various jobs that could be placed on the garment grids. Once equipped, the girls could freely switch between any of the dress spheres on the grid. They could only be changed with adjacent spheres, and much like the previous sphere system, passing through different gates unlocked certain temporary powers. The biggest bonus was that outfits could be changed in battle at any time, for the use of only one ability or the remainder of the fight. This made up for the lack of any additional party members beyond Yuna's Angels by allowing truly masterful characters to shine in a number of jobs. X-2 featured several classic classes such as Warrior, Black Mage, White Mage, and Thief. It expanded the jobs Dark Knight, Gun Mage, Berserker, and Trainer, and took some liberal departures like Gunner, Songstress, and Lady Luck. Each individual dress sphere earned skills like many other job-based installments with ability points. In addition to the integration of dress spheres, X-2 also featured a mission-based progression system, rather than the traditional linear path. Although there was a main story to follow, players were given the choice to delve into more or less of it by choosing several tasks that inched the plot along or provided some other insight on the updated world of Spira. For the most part, the choices Yuna made were irreversible and had a strong impact on later parts of the story, both positive and negative. A large percentage of the game itself didn't adhere to the central plotline, which the player may have missed entirely if their focus was only on following the story. One of the most difficult decisions Yuna made early on was whether or not to side with the Youth League or New Yevon. Multiple endings were also possible depending on the percentage of the game completed. Attaining 100% prompted a bonus ending. When you reached the finale, you had the chance to start over with experienced plus characters that took with them all the items, abilities, and dress spheres that you had at the previous conclusion. Only round 2 dropped the girls back to level 1. Despite the drastic tonal change, X-2 still had its share of notables. It was, and is, the only game of the core 3D incarnations that featured job switching, as well as the only game in the entire series that allowed you to swap them completely on the fly. In addition, X-2 is the only direct console sequel in the franchise that featured faces from the original, as well as an all-female cast of playable characters. With the success of massive multiplayer such as Nexus: The Kingdom of the Winds, released in 1996, and Ultima Online following shortly after in 97, it became clear that there was a bright future to be had in online RPGs. In 1999, EverQuest exploded the genre stateside. The same year, and immediately after completing Chronicles, Square began to test the waters of the online universe. The developers of the company's first venture into the World Wide Web had quite a task ahead of them. Final Fantasy XI went into public beta testing in Japan in August 2001, only months after the release of Final Fantasy X. 11 was one of the first games produced under Square's all-platforms, all-media ideals. This meant the game was designed to be enjoyed by gamers of different languages, localizations, and even platforms. 11 still remains one of the only MMORPGs to accommodate players from all over the world to engage each other on the same servers, rather than making certain regional distinctions. But Square's full plans for global connectivity wouldn't be fulfilled for another 4 years. Final Fantasy XI was officially released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan on May 16, 2002. The project was directed by Koichi Ishii, known for his work with Chocobos throughout the series, and produced by Hiromichi Tanaka. The patrons of the series, executive producer Hironobu Sakaguchi and image designer Yoshitaka Amano, also lent their expertise to the project. Nobuyoshi Mihara joined the team as a lead character designer, and Kumi Tanioka and Noishi Mizuta assisted Nobuo Uematsu with the massive score. Mizuta ultimately composed the music for the expansion packs that followed. At launch, Final Fantasy XI began the saga of Vana'diel and the continuing mystery of its creation. Long ago, saddened by the vanity of an ancient people known as the Xylart, the goddess Altana cried 5 tears, which bore unique races that would eventually form the backbones of 3 mighty nations. Without warning, a being known as the Shadow Lord released hordes of evil forces against the territories from his obsidian throne in Zarkabard. Each struggled with their own battles until the Archduke of Juno, a fledgling metropolis, united the nations under one banner, and eventually the Shadow Lord was subjugated. The story of 11 began 20 years later. Players started by choosing their race, nation, and name. Servers were assigned, and world passes were needed for friends who wanted to play in the same realm. After a brief introductory cutscene, the inexperienced adventurers were faced with an expansive city to explore, and a hefty quest to begin. In the west, the Quan continent gave rise to the Republic of Bastok and the Kingdom of Sandoria. Bastok, the youngest of the nations, was a place of ingenuity and development, and home to Cid, the engineer. Carved into the mountains of Gustaberg and nestled against a southern shore, Bastok relied on invention to battle the elements. Here, the innovative Humes researched new technologies as well as studied the artifacts of the past, while the mighty Galka sought refuge from a civilization abandoned and forgotten. To the north, in the forests of Ronfar, the ancient kingdom of Sandoria stood as a testament of time. The once proud empire had fallen to years of turmoil and political intrigue, complete with an aging king and 2 warring princes. Across the sea on the continent of Mindardia, the mystical Taru Taru settled the Federation of Windurst among the plains of Saruda Baruda. Naturally akin to magic and aligned with the teachings of the Star Sibyl, the Taru Taru built their city surrounding Heaven's Tower, a giant magical tree. After the ravages of the Crystal War, several Mithra, known for their agility and instinct, sought solace among the Taru Taru and were granted haven within Windurst. Connecting the continents in the midst of a massive span of bridges sat the Grand Duchy of Juno. This once meager fishing village was lifted from obscurity by the Archduke Camlino and his advanced technology. The spiraling city was a focal point for adventurers and provided air travel to the major nations. 11 borrowed numerous conventions, including a number of different adventuring types, party-oriented fighting, and attaining powerful gear, as well as improving on several aspects of the genre, including chat systems, monster aggression, character weight and animation, and item creation. 11 also featured in-game cutscenes that triggered when certain conditions were met, and it employed a fairly intuitive auto-translation system, both of which are still unique to Final Fantasy XI. order to see the wilds of Vana'diel, players were once again called upon to master various jobs. 11 is one of the first MMORPGs to allow players to completely change their online professions, while maintaining previously earned experience. In addition, players could unlock the ability to set a sub-job from any of the classes they had previously leveled. These were always capped at half of the player's main job. Balance became a big issue in the ever-changing online world. The jobs had to look and feel like their traditional Final Fantasy counterparts, while maintaining an equal playing ground for characters of similar levels. As a result, some received a noticeable shift in power. Classic jobs or abilities were incorporated into other jobs due to their specificity or limitations, as well as trying to make 50-plus levels worth of time playing that job interesting, such as a red mage's ability to enchant weapons and cast spells traditionally dubbed time magic. At the start of their adventures, players could choose from the 6 Final Fantasy basics, each easily filling an MMO niche. Warriors served as solid tanks, monks sprawled with the enemy face to face, thieves maneuvered themselves for expert damage, white mages were naturally adept healers, black mages blasted the enemy from range, and red mages were their usual jacks of all trade. After accruing experience, players had the option to undergo another Final Fantasy tradition, searching for new jobs. After seeking out a specific NPC and performing any number of tasks, level 30 players could follow the paths of the Paladin, Summoner, Dark Knight, Bard, Ranger, or Beastmaster. Although 11's focus was certainly multiplayer, there was a fairly linear story that unearthed the origins of Vana'diel. Each nation had its own set of missions and its own point of view of the beginnings of the main story, which told of the treachery of the Beastmen as they attempted to call forth the Shadow Lord within their respective strongholds. Completing these missions increased the player's rank and bestowed certain privileges, such as the ability to ride an airship. While gathering experience, players could also participate in Conquest, which earned glory for their nation and presents for their packs. Players could rise to level 50, and a number of important quests were hinged on level requirements. At 18, you could acquire your sub-job, at 20, attempt to tame a Chocobo, and at 30, start hunting for extra jobs. While Chocobos served their usual purpose of easing the cross-continent strain, friendly Moogles were given the important duty of keeping track of your online affairs, including switching jobs, managing your inventory, and furnishing your own online abode, which could be decorated with furniture and various objects. In addition to Final Fantasy XI passing over the Pacific, Vana'diel's borders were first expanded in 2003. Rise of the Xylart, originally entitled Visions of Jurat, was released in Japan at the same time as the US release of Final Fantasy XI, which included both the original Japanese launch content as well as its first pack of bonus material. The level cap of 50 was lifted, and after players completed some fairly arduous tasks, they could advance themselves to level 75. Rank was also increased from 6 to 10, and players could now complete the sagas of their various nations, which required them to trek through many of the new regions. The world of Vana'diel got another familiar Final Fantasy wash with the addition of artifact armor. On the climb from 50 to 60, players could complete a series of quests that rewarded them with powerful sets of armor germane to their given job. The artifact armor was steeped in Final Fantasy mythology. White mages wore white robes trimmed in red, warriors bore limber red plates, black mages donned conical caps, and red mages sported familiar regalia. If that uphill climb wasn't enough for dedicated fans, Rise of the Xylart also permitted training as a samurai, ninja, and finally dragoon. In addition to conquering new jobs, summoners could also master their own. Rise of the Xylart brought Vana'diel's celestial avatars from their slumber. With a strong party, players could challenge these beings for a number of rewards, including the ability to summon them in battle. For proper balance, each of the avatars was aligned to one of the elements that govern the game. Truly masterful summoners could also hope to conquer Fenrir, one of Vana'diel's terrestrial guardians. The world of Vana'diel nearly doubled with the additions of Zepwell and Elshamo Islands. Players could also visit the tropical Mithra homeland Kazam, as well as the ravaged Galka capital and the pirate haven Norg, where another Final Fantasy All-Star dwelled. The saga of Vana'diel also continued on in a series of new missions designed specifically for the Rise of the Xylart content, which spanned a massive amount of terrain, eventually enabling the player to activate a portal to Talia, the ancient floating Xylart capital. In in 2004, the world grew again with the release of the second expansion, Chains of Promathia, in the US and Europe. Chains of Promathia began an intense and complicated series of missions that started tying up many of the mysteries put forth up to that point. It told the story of a Tabnazian girl named Preesh, a dark and sinister young boy, a gathering emptiness, and a long-forgotten prophecy foretelling the coming of the Twilight god Promathia. While no untouched landmasses appeared in Vana'diel, new areas were discovered by adventurers for the first time. These included many that were accessible by everyone, and after the completion of certain missions, they could attempt to visit the ransacked countryside of Tabnazia, seek refuge in the survivor's safehold, explore the destruction at Cape Reavern, and eventually open the gateway to the celestial capital Altayu. Even though no new jobs were released with Chains of Promathia, the expansion contained a wealth of content. Promathia was also notably more difficult than prior adventures, requiring an enormous amount of time, commitment, skill, and friends willing to help you out. The payoff was well worth the effort, as Promathia rewarded players with new exclusive areas to explore and plenty of plot puzzles to solve. Diligent summoners could also attempt to challenge and command a new avatar after certain mission requirements were met. Square finally fulfilled its original promise of all platforms, all media in 2006 with the release of the third expansion pack, Treasures of Otter Gone. Along with the expansion, 11 was also released for the Xbox 360, marking the first time a Final Fantasy game was available for each console on the market. The expansion opened up the waters to the Eastern Empire of Otter Gone, a land even more shrouded in secrets than Vana'diel. Ruled by the enigmatic Empress Najmira, the fortified city of Alzabi guarded a mysterious artifact known as the Astral Candescence, which provided its citizens with enhanced powers and was under constant siege by hostile new invaders. Otter Gone also provided new jobs to master with the addition of the eagerly awaited Blue Mage and newcomers Corsair and Puppet Master. Treasures of Otter Gone took notice of current MMOs on the market and drastically curbed the difficulty levels from Chains of Promathia. Each area in the expansion was available for all players, provided they could survive the trek, and hunting in the wilds was quicker and more efficient due to a number of new system changes, such as the inclusion of an experience bonus, as long as the city maintained possession of the Astral Candescence. Since then, a number of small content additions were added that are not technically part of any expansion. These included raiding the Dream Realm of Dynamis, certain seasonal events, and PvP excursions like Ballista. Treasures of Otter Gone added a number of other games and events that focused more on teamwork, such as Besieged, Assault, and Salvage. Several technical changes were also made, including infamous attempts to rebalance some of the jobs. Eventually, a reduction was made to many of the difficulty aspects of the missions from Chains of Promathia. Chocobo breeding and racing became available, and the option to choose a server upon character creation was added. As it stands today, the community of Final Fantasy XI is over 4 million strong, with hundreds of thousands of adventurers heading online every day. Starting in 2004, Square sponsored an annual fan festival where players could leave their virtual selves behind and greet their online allies in person. The events following have included live multiplayer challenges, cosplay contests, concerts from the Star Onions, a band starring 2 of the composers from the game, and sneak peeks at upcoming expansions. Despite featuring the most elaborate storyline and immense world map the series has ever seen, Final Fantasy XI was generally shunned by even the most dedicated fans of the franchise, who scoffed at its unconventional inclusion in the Roman numeral legacy. Criticisms were mostly laid upon the persistent grinding needed to ascend through the game's ranks, along with numerous unpredictable elements common to online play. Final Fantasy XI is also a very unforgiving experience, making you work your tail off for most of the landmarks in each job's progression. But some would argue that that's what makes its achievements so rewarding when the battle is finally won. Contributions from the active population and extensive expansions like Wings of the Goddess ensured that Vana'diel would keep growing as long as there were heroes brave enough to protect its lands and adventurers bold enough to seek out its secrets. Game director Yasumi Matsuno began his career at a development company called Quest that produced games on multiple platforms from the NES to the Sega Saturn. There, he originated the Ogre Battle series that started with March of the Black Queen in 1993. He also designed Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together for the PlayStation, and the strategy franchise would release 3 additional games without his supervision. In 1995, Matsuno left Quest to join Square, and began production on a title encompassing the grid-based combat and job-leveling party structure Ogre Battle had previously made famous. Abandoning Ogre's kingdom of Valeria, this new endeavor had to take place in another world, a land Matsuno named Ivalice. Gamers first set foot on its world map in Final Fantasy Tactics, released in Japan 5 months after Final Fantasy VII. Tactics was welcomed into the Final Fantasy fold by project producer Hironobu Sakaguchi and designer Hiroyuki Ito. Akihiko Yoshida designed the characters after working with Matsuno on both Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre. The score was composed by Masaharu Iwata and Hitoshi Sakamoto. The story in Tactics was told by the historian Alislam, who sought to understand and communicate the events that led to the Lion War. Following a 50-year conflict and the death of the king, a race began to fill the throne of Ivalice. Prince Goltana of the Black Lion clan strove to install Princess Ovelia as Ivalice's true ruler, while Prince Larg of the White Lions supported the yet-of-age Prince Orinas, believing him to be the rightful heir. Amid the tumultuous political landscape was a boy named Ramza, from the noble Beowulf family, a young and naive aristocrat who would later become a mercenary. In the opening battle, he failed to protect Ovelia and witnessed her being kidnapped by his childhood commoner friend Alita Hyrule, who was previously presumed to be dead. With nothing left to believe in, Ramza embarked on a journey to recover the princess and uncover Delita's intentions. The quest would be wrought with political deceit, religious turmoil, demons, and the mysterious power of 12 Zodiac Stones. Unlike other series spin-offs, Tactics employed a battle scheme that was completely unique to the franchise. The skirmishes were still turn-based, but along with selecting an active ability, players had to be conscious of where their forces were placed on the battlefield. A blue highlighted area represented the boundaries of each character's movement, and their attack order was determined by a charge time meter. Each battle assigned you a different number of party members, but the team total always surpassed 4, sometimes encompassing 6 or more, a series first. While the fighting was a departure from what fans were used to, the class system in Tactics was a classic upgrade from Final Fantasy V. Squire and Chemist were the base jobs, evolving into warrior and mage roles respectively. Black mages were called wizards, white mages were dubbed priests, and dragoons went by lancers, but the jobs monk, archer, time mage, summoner, dancer, bard, samurai, ninja, and geomancer remained intact. And along with new professions Oracle, Mediator, and Calculator, there were 9 unique job classes that belonged to the several special characters that joined your ranks, from the sharpshooting engineer Mustadio to the fetching holy knight Agrias. The overworld map was completely linear, and random battles only took place when your crew passed through designated green waypoints on the path. Towns could only be accessed through a menu interface, with available options including accepting side quests, buying new equipment, poaching monsters, and recruiting new party members. Despite being created outside of the core series, Tactics still retained many Roman numeral niceties. Chocobos were still the preferred method of travel, though only in battle and in cutscenes. Cid appeared as Cidolfus T.G. Cid Orlandu, a knight and hero of the 50-Year War, who joined Ramza and his crew under the player's discretion. Even Cloud Strife himself stumbled into the story, complete with a convenient case of amnesia, and a stock of familiar-looking limit breaks, given that you found his materia blade, of course. While Tactics was slightly obscured by the wake of 7, it's still one of the most revered titles to bear the Final Fantasy name. The gameplay was considered gloriously diverse, the job system endlessly adjustable, and the graphical detail in the environments and attacks some of the best on the system. About the only thing that was universally disliked about Tactics was the patchy English translation, which led many gamers and reviewers to become disconnected with the plot. But the story wasn't over, and gamers would soon return to Ivalice, whether they knew they were doing so or not. Vagrant Story was released in Japan on February 10, 2000. The one-man dungeon runner didn't have Final Fantasy in its title or even in its subtext, but took place around the kingdom of Valendia, which rested in a continent north of the expanded Ivalice from future games. The story followed Ashley Riot, an agent for the VKP, or Valendia Knights of the Peace, and his new inexperienced partner, Calo Merlos. While relentlessly chasing a religious fanatic and cult leader named Sidney Losterod, Ashley frequently crossed paths with the Crimson Blades, an arm of the Cardinals Knights of the Cross, and their leader, Guildenstern. The aim of the story's villains was to achieve immortality by harnessing a force known as the Darkness, a plague which had laid waste to Leia Mond and turned its victims into the Walking Dead. Vagrant Story was more of an action affair, but it was still full of careful tactical brawls and highly customizable weapons. Enemy encounters opened up a wireframe battlesphere, and anything inside it was deemed close enough to strike or shoot. Weapons could be disassembled, gems could be infused, and magic spells or enchanted attacks could be recalled from Ashley's tortured and fragmented memory. At its release, Vagrant Story was not compared to Final Fantasy titles because its vague relation was not yet realized. But several elements made the action-adventure stand above its contemporaries. Its script was a vast improvement over Tactics. It delved into religious tones that Square previously extinguished when localizing its games, and the comic book-inspired art style was a departure from other fantasy projects on the PlayStation. Six years after the release of Tactics, gamers were taken back to its ever-transforming realm in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance in 2003. With the exception of Matsuno and Sakamoto returning, the design team was new to Ivalice and to Final Fantasy. The never-ending story of Tactics Advance was quite different from others in the saga. It told of 4 children, Marsh, Ritz, Moot, and Donid, who lived in the quiet mountain town of contemporary Saint Ivalice, each with their own insurmountable set of hurdles. After stumbling across a battered book that turned out to be an ancient magical tome known as the Grand Grimoire, which was a prominent item in Vagrant Story, the children fabricated a fantasy world based on their personal challenges and boundless imagination. Advance harkened back to a number of conventions introduced in Tactics. The maps, locales, and graphical touches were basically in the same style as the original, but the battle and job systems were also similar with some minor or distinct changes. Tactics Advance introduced Ivalice to a number of new races that would become mainstays of the realm: the reptilian Bonga, the mystic Numu, the spiritual Viera, and of course, friendly Mughals. Instead of one circle of jobs that all characters could choose from, each race now had their own circle that comprised its own selection of unique jobs, as well as variations on previous standards. Like in Tactics, some jobs became available after certain conditions were met, and different abilities could be swapped once they were mastered. The battle system retained its turn-based roots, subtly incorporating aspects of the new job improvements. Movement and order were still a major tactical factor, as well as the positioning and timing of abilities. The most significant change in the pace of battles was the inclusion of laws that restricted various abilities that could be used in each encounter. Each skirmish was presided over by a judge who maintained the laws of the battleground. Laws varied. It could range from being a simple nuisance to an incredible hindrance. Characters that broke the laws of the engagement were warned, and if multiple infractions occurred, penalized or even jailed. Obeying the laws and staying on the favorable side of the judges awarded characters with judge points that could be cashed for a number of different uses. Eventually, with the help of the haughty know-it-all Ezel, players could combat the iron fist of the judges with law cards and anti-law cards. Law cards allowed players to add laws in the hopes of restricting enemy abilities, and anti-law cards cancelled out existing law cards in play. The only areas of Ivalice that remained free of the judge's jurisdiction were dangerous zones known as the Jagd, which is German for the hunt. Upon arriving in Ivalice, Marsh was met by the Mughal Mont Blanc, who introduced him to clans and their respective wars. Marsh had the option to name his clan and help it to grow and prosper throughout the course of the game. Rival clans often challenged him for supremacy and competed in various tournaments. The clan itself consisted of all the characters the players had amassed. Different members could come and go as the missions were completed, and be dispatched on singular missions for loot, items, and other spoils. The world map of Tactics Advance was certainly the most malleable of the series, allowing for the player to customize the landscape with different area icons. Placing specific areas near others occasionally unearthed treasures that could be plundered by searching the zone. Cid played dual roles in Advance, first appearing as Moot's father in St. Ivalice. As an unemployed drunk, his persona was a polar opposite from his position of Judge Magister and husband to the Queen, when the kids made the crossover through the grimoire. Tactics Advance also introduced the world of Ivalice to a number of mysterious otherworldly guardians, first known as Totema. In addition to the pantheon accessible by the traditional Final Fantasy summoner, the Totema were powerful beings that could be called forth to damage all enemies on the battlefield. Each race had its companion totem that could be summoned when a character attained 10 judge points. These games showed followers of the Final Fantasy franchise yet another world to absorb, one that was stacked with plot layers and hidden connections for those that persistently played all three. But for those that dismissed them as spin-offs, and bypassed Final Fantasy XI for its multiplayer sacrilege, only one thing mattered: the true single-player follow-up to Final Fantasy X. Unbeknownst to this impatient army, the release date of the next core Final Fantasy, which started development in 2001, would be delayed a series record 4 times. This created a development gap of 4 agonizing years, the longest fans ever waited for another installment. Matsuno was originally assigned to direct the project, but bowed out in the summer of 2005 due to health reasons. Gamers waited and hoped. Final Fantasy XII was released in Japan on March 16, 2006, and crossed the shores to North America in October of the same year. Although Final Fantasy XII's Ivalice was most similar to the Ivalice in Tactics Advance, the majority of the design team from the original Tactics and Vagrant story returned. Matsuno's duties were split between Hiroyuki Ito and Tactics art director Hiroshi Minagawa. Akihiko Yoshida designed the characters, and Hitoshi Sakamoto composed the score. Series legends Yoshitaka Amano and Nobuo Uematsu had very little to do with 12, contributing basically the title logo and theme song, respectively. Told through the eyes of the bright youth Vaughn, 12 followed the plight of the dethroned princess Ashelia of Dalmasca and her pilgrimage to reclaim her birthright and right the wrongs inflicted upon her homeland by the ever-expanding Arcadian Empire, led by the aging Emperor Gromms and his ruthless, power-hungry son Vayne. After the murder of her husband and prince of a neighboring kingdom, Ashe went into hiding under the guise of suicide. When the Empire eventually captured her kingdom of Dalmasca and Vayne was appointed consul, she chose to hide no longer. Vaughn and his surrogate sister Penelo embarked on a number of misadventures that put them in the paths of the foppish sky pirate Balthier, his Viera companion Fran, and the disgraced Captain Bosch, who is believed to have assassinated Dalmasca's King Ramanas over the fateful treaty signing with the Empire. Eventually, the upstarts joined with the resistance led by Ashe's uncle, the Marquis Ondor, ruler of the opulent sky city of Bujerba. In addition to his opposition to the Empire, Ondor was also responsible for compiling a collection of memoirs that served as a structural narration throughout the progression of 12, similar to Al-Islam's role in Tactics. 12 also sported a number of supporting, non-playable characters that had detailed and well-developed personas and intricate backstories. Among them were the Little Lord Larsa, heir apparent and younger brother of Vayne, the steadfast Judge Gabranth, Bosch's zealous twin brother, and the swashbuckling Redis, notorious sky pirate and patron of the town of Balfenheim. In a reversal from his usual helpful nature, Cid was one of the party's many adversaries in 12, as a megalomaniacal scientist responsible for building Arcadia's airship fleet. Two of 12's system breakthroughs were truly milestones for the series. 12 marked the first time a solo 3D world could be manipulated with a free-roaming camera. This allowed the player to have full range of motion and vision for the characters at all times. In addition, a new battle system was designed to accommodate a more immediate and intuitive playstyle, similar to the online engagements of Final Fantasy XI. 12 introduced active dimension battles, which eliminated random encounters completely. All enemies were now visible and subject to rules of aggression. Although characters could be controlled manually, 12 incorporated a macro-like system for inactive characters called gambits, which allowed them to act on their own in real time based on a number of criteria. As different sections of the gambit formula were purchased or found, more complex gambits could be made. This allowed for fast and fierce battles that required very little downtime. Vaughn and his compatriots added their experience to a leveling system called the License Grid. Tying to the theme of law and judgment, the License Grid required characters to purchase permissions to use different spells, weapons, and armor. Characters still increased in level, although abilities were acquired solely through obtaining licenses. Regardless of the experience total certain enemies yielded upon death, the license points awarded were relatively standard, making the grind for abilities painless. However, due to certain plot restrictions relating to when certain abilities could be obtained or purchased, grinding license points sometimes became futile and unnecessary. The Ivalice of 12 maintained many concepts of Tactics Advance, which was the first time two Ivalices bore apparent similarities. The new races introduced in Advance returned in more intricate and expansive capacities. Judges played a very large role in 12, and several areas, such as the Yags, were explored or referred to. Mont Blanc also made a side appearance as well, as the leader of Clan Centurio, which aided Vaughn in his monster hunting endeavors. Mont Blanc's appearance also solidified that the timelines of 12 and Tactics Advance were relatively close, Tactics Advance likely being the prequel. Another aspect of Advance that carried over was the introduction of a completely new pantheon of summonable creatures, known as Espers. 12 marked the first time a given term was repeated to describe summoned creatures, as well as the first time in the numeric series, since summoning was introduced, that featured a totally different group of mystical beings. Shiva, Ifrit, and Ramu were replaced with Madius, Belias, and Adramelech, among others. Elemental strengths became less of a focus, as each Esper corresponded with the sign of the zodiac. Each Esper needed to be bound to a given character. Once selected, the choice could not be undone. In addition to the pure strength of the summoned creature, the characters could also unleash quickenings, powerful chain attacks that drew upon their mystical energy.
Should Empire join with Empire, the way will open for a new Ivalice in our time.
12 continued to move forward and refine Final Fantasy's voice acting. Extremely long pauses, odd vocalizations, and other glitchy elements were drastically minimized. The voices were brought down from the exaggerations of 10 and given a more legitimate tone. Even more heavy hitters in the voiceover community continued to flesh out the cast. John DiMaggio, who lent his talents to 10 as well, was followed by fellow Futurama alumnus Phil Lamar, who brought life to Redis. As part of the 20th anniversary celebration, 12 was given a brief makeover for its international release in August of 2007. The license grid was replaced with the Zodiac job system, which required characters to choose one of 12 smaller grids that corresponded to a particular job and sign of the Zodiac. Guest characters and Espers could now be controlled by the player. New Gambit spells and licenses were incorporated, and a new Game Plus feature was added, similar to Final Fantasy X-2. It's unknown whether the release calendar of the 4 Ivalice games so far is indicative of the chronological telling of Ivalice's story. Tactics takes place on a peninsula closed in by the land of Ordalia to the east. Vagrant's story runs through the city of Leamond, and continually references the kingdom of Valendia. Tactics Advance is hard to assimilate geographically in the timeline because the map is constructed by the player. The Ivalice 12, however, included both Valendia and Ordalia with minor spelling adjustments, despite the fact that the locations within them completely changed. It also contained several locations plotted in Tactics Advance. This led fans to assume that the block of land in the original Tactics sits on the west rim of the 12 map, possibly revealing that the Ivalice in the first PlayStation game expanded across several continents while growing over time into the overworld on the PS2. Several facts both support and destroy this theory. The bestiary in Final Fantasy XII was compiled by a woman with the last name Merlos, who might be a relative to the heroine in Vagrant's story, or Callow herself. And several of the items in Vagrant's story allude to characters from Tactics in Return. But according to Tactics, Mughals are extinct, so their inclusion in Final Fantasy XII might force the original Ivalice adventure to the end of the timeline. There are numerous theories, and none of them are correct until confirmed by the developers. But here's one we found the most interesting. Suppose Tactics and Vagrant Story were precursors to Tactics Advance, with the non-Mughal religious era eventually transforming into Saint Ivalice, similar to how Constantinople became Istanbul. Then, Moot and friends created an alternate Ivalice with their minds, one that added their favorite fantasy friends like Mughals, and new races like the Bonga and Viera. They eventually returned home, but what if this dream dimension lived on, and set the stage for Final Fantasy XII? The developers have confirmed several times that Tactics, Tactics Advance, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII all take place in the same world. But the order and relation of these chapters in Ivalice still remains a mystery. Hopefully, the sequels that have yet to be released will shed some light on the subject. In December of 2006, Square initiated the Ivalice Alliance, a series of titles all linked together by the continuing narrative of Matsuno's world. Its first entry, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, was released on April 26, 2007 in Japan. The DS RTS was unlike any previous FF release, handheld or otherwise, engaging the player in complex real-time face-offs with touchpad controls. Final Fantasy Tactics A2, another DS battle simulator, is currently under development and will be placed chronologically behind Final Fantasy XII. And a remake of the original PlayStation Crusade launched on the PSP subtitled The War of the Lions. The portable port featured new items, jobs, and full-motion cutscenes detailing major plot developments and boss encounters. However the 6 chapters in the saga of Ivalice eventually come together, the kingdom itself stands as the most expansive setting ever created in the Final Fantasy universe, and even more adventures could lie in waiting. The name Ivalice only vaguely represents a solitary region of its planet's surface, so as the Alliance marches on, there's no telling where it will end. It took 4 years for Final Fantasy to branch out beyond the franchise. Its move to the American NES in 1990 began budding its worldwide appeal, and its evolution on the Super Famicom in 1991 established it as a returning entity gamers could depend on and look forward to. Super Mario Land for the Game Boy in 1989 invited all of Nintendo's brightest to sacrifice color and continuity for the promise of owning gamers' pockets across the planet. The first spin-off in the series was released in Japan as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, which could be translated as Holy Sword Legend Final Fantasy Side Story. The name Seiken Densetsu was actually trademarked by Square in 1987, the same year the first Final launched in Japan, but was saved until the Game Boy game's working title, Geminites, was dropped. Gaiden arrived in stores on June 8, 1991, 1 month before Final Fantasy IV. Seiken Densetsu was released for the Game Boy in America on November 1st as Final Fantasy Adventure. It was Koichi Ishii's first directorial project, and the first fantasy writer Yoshinori Kitase ever worked on. The music was composed by Kenji Ito, with various franchise references contributed by Nobuo Uematsu. It followed the plight of an imprisoned gladiator who thirsted for revenge after learning of an evil plot hatched between the Dark Lord and the wizard Julius. A look at Adventure's interface might inspire thoughts of another overhead sword and shield action-based RPG, but Link awakened in his first Game Boy outing almost exactly 2 years later. Adventure's hero lacked a green tunic, but brandished a power bar that indicated the strength of his attacks. Several friendly faces he met while rolling along could join his party and add their abilities. While it might appear as if Adventure was stuck without a sequel, it actually had 8 follow-ups. When the first of these was brought to the US, it was renamed Secret of Mana, and the series secured the subname for years to come. A remake of Adventure was released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003 called Sword of Mana, reflecting on the original's bizarre combination of the two Square franchises. Adventure was a handheld offspring that would grow to have grandchildren of its own one day. But Square's second spin-off a year later stood solo. Mystic Quest was the first Final Fantasy game to be initially released in the United States. It debuted on October 5th, 1992, almost a year before it was available in Japan. The turn-based Super Nintendo Trip was created with American audiences in mind, to encourage the non-RPG playing bulk of the gaming community to give the growing genre a try. To acclimate new users to the experience, the game was simplified from the chiseled template Square had been refining, so save points, manually adjusted armor, and random battles were thrown out. What was left told the story of a map split into 4 elemental regions, each fueled by the power of their corresponding crystal. Similar to the prophecy in Final Fantasy I, it was foretold that these power sources would be stolen, and a knight would have to fight to retrieve them. A mysterious man named White bestowed a youth named Benjamin with the uneasy task, and along with fellow battle partners Kaylee, Tristram, Reuben, and Phoebe, Ben began his crusade for the crystals. As another series offshoot to attend the Hyrule School of Action-Adventure, there were added challenges like acquiring tools, using them in the overworld, and solving various environmental puzzles. Instead of occasionally initiating unseen battles, the enemies in Mystic Quest stood still on the map, and the encounters were viewed from a third-person, head-on perspective. In combat, players could run, control their allies, or choose from 4 action options. Following Final Fantasy IV, Mystic Quest had a lot to live up to. Those expecting it to be a step up marked it below the standards previously set by the franchise, and it came up short in its attempt to find a brand new audience. But given that it never received a sequel, remake, or port, the original 16-bit Expedition remains a guilty pleasure and forgotten treasure in the hearts of many that finished it. But few things incite a wave of warm nostalgia like Chocobo. And not the transports gamers have tamed over the years, but the squawking superstar that is currently played host to 11 different games, the majority of them released solely in Japan. His overseas endeavors started with Chocobo's Dungeon in 1997, which was the third in the Dungeon series that would also grow games to include characters from Dragon Quest and Pokemon. It was released for the PlayStation in Japan on December 23, 1997. Along with making mandatory appearances in the core sequels afterward, Chocobo tracks were laid on new consoles and peripherals. Chocobo Stallion was inspired by the raising and racing minigame from 7, and Chocobo World was the Pocket Station plug-in extension from Final Fantasy VIII. Other outings included Dice Day Chocobo, a board game simulator which later influenced a Game Boy Advance release called Chocobo Land, Harataku Chocobo, an occupation simulator, and Chocobo Day Mobile, a batch of on-the-go minigames. In the 10 years since the boisterous bird showed it could be bred for its own brand of RPG cuteness, only 3 of its games have been released in the States. The first was the 1998 PlayStation sequel to Chocobo's Dungeon, which surprisingly left the 2 at the end of the American title after Square had notoriously renumbered all prior fantasy-related crossovers. Its pint-sized plot included an appearance from the pilot Sid and a pink-haired white mage named Shiroma. A year later, the same characters, along with a handful of series job cameos, made an appearance in an event that mixed Magic with Mario Kart. Chocobo Racing also arrived on the PlayStation, and to date is the only standalone driving game to include series familiars like a Black Mage or Behemoth. 2006 saw the release of Final Fantasy Fables, Chocobo Tales for the Nintendo DS. Dealing out more than another dungeon crawler, Tales followed Chocobo as he dived into 8 storybook worlds that crossed Square's fantasies with popular fables. To celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Chocobo craze, Square announced a third dungeon game being developed as a Nintendo Wii exclusive. Its title is loosely translated as Labyrinth of Forgotten Time, and its underground layers actually exist in people's minds, requiring the series mascot to destroy their worst nightmares firsthand. Chocobo Games might be as far as fans are willing to go, while still considering the subject matter related to the series they cherish. But it's hard to deny the charm each chirp a Chocobo makes, whether it's taking the pole position in a pair of rollerblades, or descending into the deepest dungeon to save its friends. The first Final Fantasy cutscene lit up gamers' televisions around the world when 7 was released in 1997, and when an animated camera pulled back to reveal the city of Midgar in its entirety. Fans were forever hooked on the technology, as well as the crucial tool for telling a story as epic as the one Square was attempting. The closest thing fans had seen to a strictly animated retelling of any Final Fantasy story was an episode of Captain N, the Game Master, called The Fractured Fantasy of Captain N, that aired on October 26, 1991. It was the 34th and final episode of the short-lived series. But then, 3 years later in '94, players got their first chance to sit back and watch a Final Fantasy called Legend of the Crystals, released directly to VHS in 4 episodes. The original video animation produced by Madhouse Studios was a sequel to Final Fantasy V, and it took place 200 years after the Super Famicom RPG. The cast was largely unfamiliar, although the novice summoner Lenali was said to be a direct descendant of Bart's, and Lena's lineage, the Kingdom of Tycoon, returned. The other lead warriors, Pretz, Valkis, and Rouge, didn't realize their significance until Mid appeared, as a disembodied spirit, to fill in the heroes and viewers on what had happened since his death. Hand-drawn animation and Final Fantasy went together beautifully, but the series-branded characters would only be crafted by computers as the games continued. The only additional paper and ink project aired on Japanese television 4 years later. Loosely based on the 14-year-old franchise, Final Fantasy Unlimited aired for 25 episodes starting on October 2nd, 2001. The series took the brand and ran with it, offering up new monsters, areas, characters, and scenarios that 10 games in the franchise had yet to produce. The anime studio Gonzo and director Mahiro Maeda created their own version of the popular universe called Wonderland, but it still contained some iconic cameos. Chocobos and Cactar engaged the party on several occasions. A Cid was responsible for the bulk of the available modes of travel, and a ghost train, similar in theme to the Phantom model in Final Fantasy VI, brought the children I and U, along with their impromptu guardian Lisa, to the strange world in search of their parents. The story of Unlimited ended abruptly, but continued on in various novels and comic books. While these episodes were happily gobbled up by fans who added them to the decades worth of media unleashed by the franchise, they weren't dreamt up or executed by the main minds behind Square's foremost properties. It seemed those creative forces were interested in focusing on little other than placing more polished Roman numerals in a row. But little did fans know that the ideas Sakaguchi had been gathering since his mother died would eventually become a feature film that would break new ground in realistic digital animation. Sakaguchi signed on to direct the project following Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy Spirits Within premiered on July 13, 2001, within a week of the release of 10. It was produced by Chris Lee, who also produced Superman Returns. It was written by Al Reinert and Jeff Vinter, who also wrote Apollo 13 and I, Robot. The music was composed by Elliot Goldenthal, who had 2 Academy Award nominations and would win the Golden Idol in 2002 for Frida. Spirits Within had a tremendous cast, assembling the most recognizable group of actors for any Final Fantasy project on a console or in a DVD player. The ensemble included Alec Baldwin, Ming Na, Ving Rhames, Steve Buscemi, and Perry Gilpin, with James Woods as the stubbornly destructive General Hein and Donald Sutherland as the patient and practical scientist, Dr. Sid. The 106-minute pre-rendered cutscene took an overwhelming powerhouse of processing technology to create. Square acquired 4 SGI Origin 2000 servers, 4 Onyx 2 systems, 167 Octane workstations, and rendered each frame on 960 Pentium 2s. The film was as big a risk as Final Fantasy I and VII, but Square's creativity hadn't failed them. Yet. The major concern was that Spirits Within, as gamers would soon discover, had very little to do with Final Fantasy. It's the only story Sakaguchi has ever conjured that took place on Earth, with constant real-world reminders like the moon, New York City, and a subtle cameo by the creator himself. It referred to Gaia as an Earth Mother Force, gave an unmistakable visual homage to Seven's lifestream, and Chocobo designs made almost invisible appearances, but everything else was straight science fiction. Perhaps for this reason, Spirits Within finished its box office run as an unbelievable bomb. Square lost more money on the film than any project they had previously undertaken. The movie took $137 million to make, including its $30 million marketing budget, and its theatrical yield barely surpassed $44 million. This ended Square Pictures, but before they closed their doors, they reused their technology for a portion of the 2003 short collection, The Animatrix, called The Final Flight of the Osiris. Neither the Matrix crew nor the studio staff would survive the fateful mission. Madhouse, the studio behind Legend of the Crystals, also produced an animated short for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that began in 2004, called Last Order. The 25-minute duo of flashbacks followed the memories of Turk Commander Zhang. Half of the short reflected on the destruction of Nibelheim, while the other focused on Zack and Cloud's escape from Shinra forces. Last Order was released as an extra with a film that, unlike Spirits Within, never received a theatrical release. To date, it's the only motion picture sequel to a Final Fantasy game ever created. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children was released in Japan on September 14, 2005, and the red carpet was rolled out in the United States on April 25th. It was only released on DVD and PSP UMD. It was directed by Tetsuya Nomura, who originally drew the characters. Takeshi Nozue co-directed after supervising the animated cutscenes in 9, 10, and 10-2. Yoshinori Kitase, who directed 7, produced the film along with Shinji Hashimoto, who also produced 8 and 9. AC was written by Kazushige Nojima, who scripted the bulk of 7, 8, 10, and 10-2, as well as compilation pieces Crisis Core and Before Crisis. The music was written entirely by Nobuo Uematsu. Advent Children picked up the story 2 years after Meteor almost removed Midgar from the map. It brought back all the surviving characters, and even some that were presumed dead. To give them life like never before, voices were assigned, including actresses Rachel Lee Cook and Mina Suvari. 11 actors were also cast to perform the movement for each model, including fight choreography unlike fans or moviegoers had ever seen. More significant, though, was the startling transition each of the heroes made once their blocky PlayStation personas were realistically rendered, thanks to Square's latest leap in computer animation. Tetsuya Nomura's designs were all given flesh and blood, with detail rivaled only by the cutscenes in Final Fantasy XII. The film revisited several familiar locations, but also introduced a few new villains. Three supposed siblings of Sephiroth, led by the sinister Kadaj, suddenly appeared and demanded to know the whereabouts of Jenova, who they claimed was their mother. With the remains of Shinra and the Turks keeping the corpse under wraps, and Cloud trying his best to avoid more conflict and responsibility, the three troublemakers brought the world back to the brink of destruction. They used a plague called Geostigma to rally a group of infected children and strike at the planet they felt was killing them. Cloud got assistance from his former party members, but ultimately had to face Kadaj himself. This, and a rumored second showdown with Sephiroth, vacuumed 93% of the original shipment of DVDs, 420,000 copies, off store shelves in the first week. More of the saga became available in a story collection called On the Way to a Smile, written by Kazushige Nojima. Adventure, Mystic Quest, Chocobo, Unlimited, Legend of the Crystals, Spirits Within, Last Order, Advent Children. At first glance, these developments from Square seem to share no similarities. From action-adventure handheld games, to card-based child-friendly puzzlers, to episodic television, to motion pictures meant for the big and small screen, they have no direct link to speak of. But unified, they represent the power in the notion of Final Fantasy. Simply attaching its name to something invokes a sense of prestige and excitement. This inherent hype can either lead to colossal disappointment or universal acclaim. The series is famous for constantly reinventing itself, so when it branches out into new genres, consoles, and mediums, the world waits and wonders, what will Square do next? Although Adventure would eventually become its own series, it was branded as Final Fantasy in both America and Japan. But 2 years earlier, what was at the time believed to be Square's first handheld fantasy offshoot was also developed for the black and white device. It was the original Game Boy's first RPG. Makai Toshi Saga was released in Japan on December 15, 1989. When it journeyed to America in September of 1990, it was renamed Final Fantasy Legend, presumably to capitalize on the popularity of the original NES release America received 2 months earlier. It was directed by Akitoshi Kawazu, who assisted with the game design on Final Fantasy I and II, and was recently one of the executive producers of Final Fantasy XII. Kawazu would also direct Legend's 2 Game Boy sequels and produce or direct the 6 console follow-ups. The series' 7th installment was the first to regain its original franchise name in the US, when it started a 3rd trilogy in 1998 as Saga Frontier. When the Super Famicom follow-up to Legend 3, Romancing Saga, was brought to the PlayStation 2 in 2005, North American gamers began to realize the Legend trio had close to nothing to do with Final Fantasy. In 1994, 1 year after the release of Legend 3, Square released Final Fantasy VI. Despite Square's long and fruitful relationship with Nintendo, 6 was the final installment in the saga to grace Nintendo's consoles for almost a full decade. Nothing with Final Fantasy in the title was ever released for the Nintendo 64. In 2002, the release of the GameCube closed many of the technical gaps that caused Square to jump ship, but its exclusive deal with Sony stood as a roadblock to other platform creators. In order to circumvent these ties, Square helped to create the Game Designer Studio, with none other than Akitoshi Kawazu at the helm, then head of Square's production team too. Kawazu held the majority of the shares, so the Game Designer Studio was able to develop games for Nintendo. Its first and only creation capitalized on the experimental technology running on the Cube's current canon. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was released in Japan at the end of 2003 and in North America early the next year. Kawazu acted as executive producer. Kazuhiko Aoki, who had worked extensively on Final Fantasy IX and had been connected with Final Fantasy since 3, directed the project. The art and characters were designed by Toshiyuki Irahana, who assisted Shuko Murase with 9. Kumi Tanioka, known for her work on Final Fantasy XI and several Chocobo games, composed the whimsical score. The story of Crystal Chronicles was far less linear than the numbered series. The planet was covered in a caustic dark miasma that sapped the life and energy from all it touched. The only force that could repel the miasma was the power of giant mystical crystals that gave life to the world. In order to protect their civilizations, many townships harnessed the crystals to defend themselves. However, the crystal's energy was temporary and constantly needed to be recharged. The only thing capable of restoring power was the vital essence myrrh, which grew within sacred trees scattered across the map. In order to continue the power cycle, the town elders sent out crystal caravans to discover the hidden plants. There, the invaluable essence was extracted and contained in crystal chalices, which were empowered with shards of the Great Crystal in order to protect the heroes from the harsh environment. As part of the caravan from the diverse town of Tipa, you were sent out by Roland, the village elder, and charged with the welfare of the crystal and her people. The caravan would travel for several years, returning after 3 deposits filled the chalice and forced the adventurers to be reunited briefly with their loved ones. You could choose a particular trade when you created your character, with each house excelling in a particular skill. While away, you could maintain communication with your family through a Moogle delivery service. Your folks could send news and even presents related to the family business. Like the original Final Fantasy, the main character in Crystal Chronicles was named by the player. You could choose from 4 stylized races, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. The Clavets were most similar to humans who farmed the fields of Fum. Although small, the Lilties constructed a vast empire of the past built upon the weaponry created in the Catharigian mines. The Selkies were a tribe of fur-wearing nomads that had an unclear past. And lastly, the Ukes, who escaped control of the Liltian Empire by fortifying the city of Shella, formed a sluice that diverted water to some of the more arid regions of the world. Gameplay in Crystal Chronicles was different from many of its predecessors and completely unique to anything else on the market, thanks to the utilization of the GameCube's Game Boy Advance link cable, allowing players to control their characters with the handheld and check its screen for vital stats and available actions. Battles were fast-paced and real-time, similar to combat in Zelda or Mana. Complex advancement systems were abandoned in favor of a more tangible, action-oriented approach that offered fewer options but more manageability of active commands. The first was a basic attack that could be strung together for combos or charged for a range shot. Throughout the various dungeons and battlefields, spheres of Magicite dropped off certain enemies that enabled the use of different classic spells, such as Fire and Life. Depending on the number of command slots available, varied combinations of Magicite were used to create fusion spells, such as Holy or Gravity. Magicite was only specific to the dungeon in which it was found, and would be lost when the task at hand was completed. As dungeons were cleared and bosses were defeated, players could choose from a list of artifacts they had collected that added bonuses to their abilities. Upon completing the dungeon, the player was able to pick one, and the others were lost. Artifacts varied from statistical bonuses to rings, which permitted the casting of certain spells, regardless of what area was being explored. Although Crystal Chronicles had an engaging story and innovative gameplay, its primary lure was multiplayer connectivity. True to GameCube form, Chronicles allowed players to set out with up to 3 of their friends. The addition of extra caravanners added a number of changes and enhancements to the experience, while simultaneously comprising a few technical and financial challenges. In order to engage in multiplayer or cooperative mode, everyone, including Player 1, needed the link cable and a GBA. The setup had been utilized before on Zelda games like Wind Waker and the Four Swords, but with them, the technology was used mostly for additional content. In Crystal Chronicles, it was a necessity. Players could check their inventory, swap out spells, shop, and do other such activities without disturbing the other players. However, the character remained vulnerable at all times. Many questioned if a more intuitive inventory management system would have been better than the complicated and expensive requirements. GBA issues aside, multiplayer successfully added another level of depth to the game. Fusion was no longer available simply by adding additional magicite to the command list, and players needed to time the execution of certain spells in order to achieve greater effects. Also, impromptu roles were assigned randomly that helped in completing tasks. Each GBA screen displayed various pieces of information, such as a minimap and enemy positions and statistics. This allowed one player to be navigator, leader, chalice carrier, and so on. Communication and teamwork was essential to be as efficient as possible. The storybook overworld map was mostly linear, but many colorful personalities sprung up along the windy path. These included leaders of other caravans, such as Sol Rocked and Amidati, Gertie, a Clavet charlatan, and the mysterious Black Knight. They also reimagined some favorites, such as Stiltskin and Artemisian, the Moogle duo from Final Fantasy IX, as well as the infamous Mog, who helped carry the Crystal Chalice from time to time and willingly volunteered for some extreme makeovers. Although the saga of Crystal Chronicles continued on, the game designers did not. By 2006, and shortly after its merge with Enix, Square acquired the studio, in addition to Taito and a number of other companies. Although the GDS no longer exists, the majority of the creative team that gave birth to Crystal Chronicles, including Kawazu, Idahana, and Tanioka, returned to begin development on 2 new chapters. Ring of Fates is a prequel planned for the DS which expands on the core gameplay of the GameCube original, and follows the story of brother and sister, Yuri and Chelinka. The Chronicles will fill out the Nintendo platform line with the release of its intended sequel, The Crystal Bearers, for the Wii, which will be more of a single-player experience than the other iterations. Adventure was the inception of a franchise, but it was soon rebranded and renamed. Legend was already its own entity, but American Game Boy owners were told a different story. Crystal Chronicles, however, has slowly become an arm of the Final Fantasy tree, rather than an apple that dropped a few feet from it. In April of 2003, Square merged with Enix, and its newly conjoined library of games became an unrivaled force in the role-playing genre. But a couple of years before the unprecedented unity, sometime around the turn of the century, a Square executive and one of the top minds at Disney Studios stepped into an elevator together. When they stepped out, they had already drawn the first line in an animated crossover of unimaginable proportions. The Kingdom Hearts series was produced by Shinji Hashimoto, penned in part by Kazushige Nojima, and composed by Yoko Shimomura. Most of the other design credits fell to Tetsuya Nomura, who directed, designed the characters, and was responsible for the concept. Nomura's task was to create a game in which aspects of familiar Disney characters and worlds meshed with aspects of various Final Fantasy games. Nomura attempted to utilize different Disney locales that all had distinct looks and feels, and merged the backdrop with many Final Fantasy characters he had a hand in creating. These two elements were brought together with the aid of an original story by Nomura that followed the plight of 3 children, Sora, Riku, and Kairi. The first Kingdom Hearts was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan on March 28, 2002. It was slightly retooled and adjusted for its North American release that following September. The original game found Sora, Riku, and Kairi at their home on Destiny Islands. Just as the 3 friends began to yearn for distant lands, the islands were attacked by dark beings known as the Heartless. After being separated from his friends, Sora discovered an artifact called the Keyblade. Soon after, he was joined by emissaries sent from Disney Castle to locate the blade, as well as its wielder. 2 of the most recognizable animated characters in history followed Sora throughout his adventures. Donald Duck took the role of a courtly mage, and Goofy, captain of the Royal Guard. The crew began their trip in Traverse Town, a world unique to Kingdom Hearts. Leon, as well as other Final Fantasy faces, explained that the Heartless were using various keyholes to travel between worlds and capture their hearts. This represented the only direct connection to previous Final Fantasy games. Sora's charge as wielder of the Keyblade was to close the passages and keep the world safe from the Heartless. But he also wanted to rescue Riku and Kairi in the process. this search was thwarted by the magnificent Maleficent and her plan to harness the power of the 7 Princesses of Heart to open the keyhole to Kingdom Hearts, the collective of hearts and a reservoir of knowledge. The game's finale prompted even more questions about the overly analyzed life-pumping organ, and it's taken 2 games since to try and answer them. The first sequel, Chain of Memories, was released for the Game Boy Advance in late 2004 and was one of the first GBA games to incorporate full-motion video. It directly followed the first game, opening with Pluto and later a dark figure pointing Sora, Donald, and Goofy in the direction of Castle Oblivion. The strange edifice was the base of Marluxia, a member of the Shrouded organization, which would later be given the suffix 13. Sora, Donald, and Goofy ascended to the top in hopes of finding Riku and Kairi. As they climbed higher, Sora and friends lost their recent memories, but stirred up old events long forgotten. The levels were projections of Sora's mind, and Chain of Memories introduced a new card-based system of navigating them and interacting with their enemies. Several characters important to the development of the story were also introduced, such as Naminé, a young girl with strange powers over memories, and Diz, an enigma wrapped in bandages. It also featured another unlockable mode, which shed light on Riku's story and his own personal battles. Both flights through the castle revealed an equal amount of secrets and riddles, and put Sora's fate in jeopardy. The third installment would begin with an entirely new protagonist. Kingdom Hearts 2 was released for the PlayStation 2 on December 22, 2005 in Japan, and March 28th of the following year in North America, as the search for Riku and Kairi continued. 2 was very similar to the original, but improved on a number of aspects that were thought lacking. The sequel added a drive bar that allowed for a variety of form switching, as well as more flexibility with summoned characters. Reaction commands were now possible, based on variables unique to certain enemies. It also made a number of improvements to the Gummy Ship system, which Sora and friends used to travel through the Disney universe in both Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. 2 began 1 year after Chain of Memories and followed Roxas, a new face who had closer ties to Sora than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't long before Roxas encountered nobodies, which were shells of those left behind when a Heartless was formed. These half-humans drove the plot forward, calling upon villains new and old to continue their charge against Mickey's kingdom. Each Disney film relived through Sora's eyes was conceived as its own world, recreating numerous iconic landmarks and often scenarios ripped right from the celluloid print. Among them were Alice's Wonderland, the Deep Jungle, the 100-Acre Wood, Agrabah, Atlantica, Neverland, Halloween Town, the Beast's Castle, Timeless River, Port Royal, and Space Paranoids, in addition to new worlds created especially for the series. A number of extra familiar Disney characters could be called into battle to aid Sora, much like the summoning system of Final Fantasy XII. Donald and Goofy departed the battlefield in place of Aladdin's Genie, Chicken Little, Stitch, Dumbo, and Tinkerbell, to name a few. Each sidekick aided Sora for a limited time and possessed a special attack. A short list of Final Fantasy characters prompted guest sightings, as the series was mostly dominated by Disney's long line of movie stars. Square cameos were relegated to Vivi and Setzer's competitive struggle matches, Waka, Titus, and Selphie's appearance on Destiny Islands, and a few brief moments shared with the trio of Pixies from Final Fantasy X-2. Their influences varied, as Cloud appeared to have Vincent Valentine costume pieces in Kingdom Hearts 1, but clearly resembled his Advent Children counterpart in 2. Following in the footsteps of Final Fantasy X, the Kingdom Hearts series utilized voice acting to tell most of its story. When possible, a strong effort was made to preserve the original Disney performers. Reprising their timeless roles were Catherine Beaumont, Jodie Benson, Robbie Benson, Kenneth Mars, Chris Sarandon, James Woods, Scott Weinger, Robert Guillaume, David Ogden Stiers, Angela Lansbury, and Bruce Boxleitner, among many others. In order to give life to many of the Final Fantasy characters who didn't have voices, as well as characters unique to the Kingdom Hearts series, Square employed a number of popular performers. 2 of the Kingdom Hearts creations, Sora and Riku, were voiced by Sixth Sense child star Haley Joel Osment and Seventh Heaven heartthrob David Gallagher. Joining them were the vocal talents of Lance Bass, Brittany Snow, and Christopher Lee. Billy Zane, David Boreanaz, and Mandy Moore also lent their voices to Kingdom Hearts, but were replaced for Kingdom Hearts 2 with other standbys, many of whom Square used in Advent Children. Other legends of the voiceover world, such as Dan Castellaneta and Tress MacNeille, both known for their work on The Simpsons, filled in the cast. Industry crossovers like Kingdom Hearts are often dreamt up and pleaded for by fans, but the rare results are never executed to the production standards Square and Disney set on the series, or received as warmly as it's been over the years. 3 Kingdom Hearts sequels have been announced that will take the storyline in unthinkable directions. Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 both received substantial sales numbers and kudos from gamers of all ages. But the theme is also a mixture that's as puzzling as it is lovable. Instead of letting the concepts collide like the Jetsons meet the Flintstones, Nomura made it an astonishingly complex world unto itself. So much so that he even altered characters first drawn by his own hand. The infant franchise may have had Walt and Hironobu fans scratching their heads, but Kingdom Hearts has already established itself as a rival to the 2 massive forces that inspired it. If the spin-offs of Final Fantasy represent how popular its evolving world has become, then these 3 franchises, Legend, Crystal Chronicles, and Kingdom Hearts, are proof that its influence will never die. It may take up to half a decade for a Final Fantasy Roman numeral to assume its shape, but while fans wait, there will always be plenty of diversions to keep them looting with their allies or getting reunited with adoring childhood companions. The first Final Fantasy was ported in Japanese in 1989, a year before it sailed to the US. It was revised for the MSX2, a Microsoft-sponsored device made available by numerous manufacturers. The personal computer's color palette bolstered the game's vibrancy, but the pixel count remained the same. It suffered from new loading times, and games had to be saved on extra blank floppies, but you could have as many saves as you had space. On December 9, 2000, with relationships between Square and Nintendo still frayed, Final Fantasy went handheld for the first time. But instead of the Game Boy Advance, it was released for the WonderSwan Color, a portable device from Bandai. 8 bits of graphical detail were added to the heroes, monsters, and backgrounds, and gameplay elements were included that mirrored updates the franchise had developed in the 13 years since the original launched on the Famicom. Final Fantasy I on the WonderSwan was released the same month the handheld hit stores, could be purchased as a promotional bundle, and ended up being the Swan's top-selling game. Neither the WonderSwan nor the MSX2 was popular in America, so the States got an updated copy of Final Fantasy I for the first time in a 2-disc set called Final Fantasy Origins, released in 2003. Origins introduced a bestiary and art gallery, along with a remixed musical score tuned to the standard set in Final Fantasy IX, and 2 difficulty settings. But Origins was not the first time Final Fantasy was ported over. Chronicles was released 4 years earlier. The collection included 4 and Square favorite Chrono Trigger. Being from the 16-bit era, the graphics in 4 remained mostly untouched. In 1999, Final Fantasy Anthology brought 5 to the US, legally for the first time. America's intro to the job system was paired with Final Fantasy VI. Following Anthology, Origins was released last, and brought 2 overseas for its American premiere, along with 1. All of the PS1 remakes were developed by Tosei, who was also responsible for bringing Valkyrie Profile and Final Fantasy Tactics to the PSP. Moving from a cartridge to a CD, the games also suffered from slow loading times, but they started and ended with breathtaking pre-rendered cinemas showing Amano's 2D creations in motion. Finally, Nintendo and Square buried the hatchet, likely after Square saw the breakout hit that was the Game Boy Advance. And 2003 saw the release of the first Final Fantasy for the system, Tactics Advance. The new Game Boy was capable of reproducing the visuals of the Super Nintendo, and then some, so Square, now Square Enix, called upon Tosei to recall its legacy once again. To engage role players that had potentially played these games 1, 2, 3, even 4 times already, the advanced versions added new monsters, abilities, dungeons, storylines, and slight graphical touches. The music, while not as crisp as on the PlayStation, could be replayed at any time from an all-new music player,
available in each port. While the PlayStation recreations ended in a compilation of the first two Final Fantasies, Tosei began with another joint retelling of 1 and 2 called Dawn of Souls, released in 2004. Dawn of Souls felt similar to the easy mode found in Origins, without the option to play at normal difficulty. These changes were implemented to favor the GBA's family-oriented audience. But the fans weren't left behind. Dawn of Souls featured several added dungeons included in 2 extended mini-adventures you could unlock by completing each game, called Soul of Chaos and Soul of Rebirth. Soul of Chaos took you deep within each of the temples unlocked when you destroyed the 4 fiends one by one. These dungeons were up to 40 levels deep, had randomly generated floors, and showcased bosses returning from Final Fantasy III, IV, V, and VI. Soul of Rebirth mode continued the story of Final Fantasy II into the afterlife, following deceased characters Minwu, Scott, Joseph, and Ricard. You had to unite the fallen warriors and guide them to a makeshift town run by a bewildered Cid, and through a light version of the Emperor's Pandemonium. Each year following brought back another fantasy on the durable handheld. 4 opened up a new dungeon called the Lunar Ruins that offered character-specific trials, rewarding the player with some of the most powerful items in the game. Final Fantasy V added 4 new jobs, a 30-floor bonus dungeon, and an additional stage called the Cloister of the Dead. Finally, 6 in 2007 included new spells, summons, and an extended dungeon called the Dragon's Den. By 2006, most of the original Final Fantasies had been remade at least 3 times, but one chapter remained completely untouched. Final Fantasy III, released only for the Famicom in 1990, was reimagined for the Nintendo DS 16 years later in 2006. In addition to being the first time American audiences could legitimately experience the 3rd volume in the numeric saga, it gave the original game a substantial facelift. The overhead view of the earlier games was given a more dynamic feel, and battles were now in 3D. The basic job system and plot development remained primarily the same. 3 for the DS gave the previously anonymous protagonists small introductory stories, but Luneth, Ark, Refia, and Ingus still functioned as all-purpose adventurers, like their nameless ancestors. Cutscenes were added to depict the new characters, and subtle plot elements were fleshed out, but the overall story was unchanged. All of the classic jobs returned, some reflected their more modern titles, and Onion Knight was now a bonus job, as the orphans began as freelancers. Guests also aided the party on rare occasions, instead of merely tagging along. After their sprites were preened and polished a record 4 times, few imagined that Square Enix would consider a 5th remake to be in order. But with the handheld market opening up beyond Nintendo's empire, Final Fantasy I and II arrived on the PSP in the summer of 2007 to celebrate the original's 20th anniversary. The widescreen upgrades looked better than ever, crammed in all of the content from the PS1 and GBA iterations, and featured even more bonus quests and spells. While these revisions have come with new dungeons, difficulty levels, and archived information, they've also received adjustments to their dialogue and narration. When dealing with fantasy names and mythological references, words do not translate directly. Making sense of squares is an ongoing source of debate among the Final Fantasy community, and the scripts are constantly being revised and updated to more correctly reflect the original Japanese content. This has been both enlightening and alienating to fans of other languages, as certain aspects were corrected from previous mistranslations, while the others were obscured by concepts that had little to no meaning when translated more accurately. Back in the infancy of Square's role-playing empire, memory and coding requirements were legitimate hurdles for naming and text. This affected both Japanese and English audiences and led to changes such as Goblin being referred to as Imp in the original and several subsequent fantasies. This also forced the early storytellers to work with very limiting dialogue space. Complex emotions and relationships were very challenging as characters couldn't express themselves to their imagined limits. This wall was removed as technology developed, and the ports of the original games were given more complicated lines of dialogue
than their predecessors. Along similar lines, some concepts translated more loosely than others. This allowed for greater specificity for certain reoccurring themes in future games, as well as remakes. This could be as simple as Shiva's signature attack, now known as Diamond Dust, originally being titled Gem Dust, or as complicated as the etymology of the Dark Knight ability Soul Eater, originating as simply as dark or darkness. When dealing with names or famous mythological creatures, the sound profiles of different languages came into play. Translators may not have been initially aware of this issue, which led to certain characters or places having subtle mistranslations in earlier versions. A single letter or sound may have been changed, such as the original kingdom of Corneria in Final Fantasy being corrected to the more anglicized Cornelia. The Fiend of Fire in the first game, Kari, was probably initially intended to be named Kali, after the destructive Hindu goddess. However, she received the moniker Malorus from her Final Fantasy IX incarnation for Origins and Dawn of Souls. Certain sounds that exist in some languages do not exist in others, or may be represented by different letters or combinations. This, in addition to early memory restrictions, turned the translation of certain creatures into a guessing game of sound recognition. Sometimes notorious monsters were translated correctly nearly all of the time, such as everyone's favorite floating eye being named for the Persian demon, Ahriman. Some were more challenging, however. Thus, the creature from 6, first translated as Pumbaba, had no seeming connection to anything in recognized lore. Add the correctly translated Humbaba, and the beast took its place among the many facets Final Fantasy borrowed from the Babylonian tradition, in this case, most specifically, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Oftentimes, when dealing with myths of other cultures, sounds that exist in the original language cannot be duplicated at all or even approximated. Then, when translated into other languages, the new forms lacked the sounds from either the parent or the core translation. The end result was a word that barely resembled what was intended. This game of translation telephone is seen in the 4 fiends from Final Fantasy IV, who were originally meant to be a reference to Dante's Inferno. Scarmiglione, Barbaricha, Canyazo, and Rubicante were all devils known as Malabranche, who dwelled in the 5th ridge of the 8th layer of Hell, Malabolge. A number of sounds in the Italian language became lost when translated into Japanese, and even more were lost on its first translation into English. It may be easy to see how Rubicante became Rubicant, or even how Barbaricha became Valvalis. However, without all of the pieces to the puzzle, Milon bears little resemblance to the original Scarmiglione. Some concepts were deemed too risque for American audiences in the early stages of Final Fantasy. This begot translations with religious-free concepts, dialogue, and abilities, among other things. An example of this from Final Fantasy IV was the exclusion of Rosa's Prey ability and the change of holy to white. These were corrected for the GBA port. However, not all of the updated translations made universal sense. With the US release of Final Fantasy VIII, the spell system switched from a progressive numeric system to the one with various suffixes the franchise had been using from the start. Fire 2 and Fire 3 became Fira and Firaga. Nearly all of the remakes adhere to this newer system of naming spells, changing the names of many magic attacks to reflect their modern nomenclature. Whether or not this made sense in the Japanese language, it changed the English system from one that showed progression to a system that made no categorical sense when translated and created nonsense forms of actual words. Final Fantasy is not the only series to be remade several times, but it has received more ports than anything else, 17 so far. And those don't include the original localizations, which had language discrepancies fans wouldn't become aware of for another decade. But just like Square is eager to start drawing on a blank slate with each new Final Fantasy, they're also willing to admit when they've made a translation goof, and work continually to get closer to the original version. This means there might still be hidden meanings out there that those with a command of both English and Japanese have yet to discover. all began with 4 orbs, spheres that carried the power to save the world or destroy it. They were labeled according to the 5 elements of Japanese mythology: earth, fire, wind, and water, with the 5th representing the void beyond our everyday understanding or experience. These were changed to crystals in the remakes of Final Fantasy that followed. The concept was strangely absent from the first sequel, but returned in 3 to birth the job system. Cecil began 4 by stealing the water crystal from Acidia, King Tycoon witnessed the wind crystal shatter in the beginning of 5, and the espers from 6 disintegrated into shards of crystallized magicite. 7's materia harkened back to the sphere model, as they not only helped the heroes advance in power, but almost caused Meteor to run right through the planet. 8, like 2, had neither. Rather than receive their energy from objects, Squall and his classmates drew it directly through enemies, or points plugged into the planet. 9 reflected its sprite history by making a crystal caught between dimensions responsible for the existence of life on Gaia, but 10 and 10-2 jumped back to spheres as experience markers and puzzle pieces. 11 started literally with a spinning crystal, along with a set of 5 that created the diverse races. And although 12 deferred its spiritual source to the zodiac signs, their emblems were encased in ornate crystals once their corresponding espers had been defeated. The Sun Christ in 12 chipped off 3 shards of brand new nethicite that united Ivalice under the rule of King Wraithwall. 10 and a half of the 12 Final Fantasies have used crystals or orbs to serve as the emotional link to the planet's life force. If one were to create a Final Fantasy from scratch, deciding on one, the other, or neither is a good place to start. The 12 core entries bear no direct ties aside from rumors and mild suggestions, but their structure has held long enough to imprint several traits on the franchise. In this 13th and final chapter of our retrospective, let's look at the ones that left the most identifying marks. Following crystals and orbs, the story has to take shape, and there are several common themes to call upon when constructing the narrative. The kingdoms in each Final Fantasy have gotten bigger and bigger, but they've almost always been dominated by an ancient evil, or stood to oppress a much smaller rebellion. There has often been a conflict of nature versus technology. The later fantasies centered on an eternal struggle for the planet to renew itself. With their world imbalanced, a group would volunteer or be summoned to fulfill a destined ritual and vanquish the forces of evil single-handedly. The origin of the first gathering is unknown because you could assemble them yourself. The following 4 parties were all orphaned youths, or lost their parents as the conflict rose. The second team likely knew each other from childhood, as well as the third, which was raised by the same guardian. The fourth largely served in the military together, and the fifth discovered each other as the long journey began. The sixth joined a resistance group that first gave a name to the frequently outnumbered gathering of forces opposing the tyrannical government. Banon's army in 6 was called the Returners. Barrett's clan in 7 was known as Avalanche. Renoa's rebels waved the flag of the Forest Owls in 8. Baku's Tantalus troop in 9 might have thought that they were up to no good, but their actions ended up saving Princess Garnet in her kingdom. And 11 had Tenshodo and a number of other resistance groups. Aside from the Gullwings moniker, the alliances in 10 and 12 were anonymous. The team count was 4 in the first 3 Final Fantasies, 5 and 4, and 4 again in parts 5 and 6. It dropped to 3 in episodes 7 and 8, returned to 4 and 9, and went back to 3 in 10 and 10-2. 11 fanned out to 6 to accommodate multiplayer parties, and 12 halved the group once again to 3. To sum up, that's 4 with 3, 5 with 4, and 1 with 5 and 6. But numbers mean nothing without a solid combination of characters from varying classes. 5 was the first where you weren't able to finish the game with one of the members you started with, and 6 was the first that let you assemble a squad of numerous collected characters from a selection menu. The themes brought up in the naming of the playable populace stretch over a variety of influences. Aspects of nature heavily inspired many characters. Some draw symbols from Japanese culture, such as the original names of the main characters in 10, Tita and Yuna, being an Okinawan reference to the sun and moon. Others, such as Cloud and Squall, derive from English roots. Vivi, from 9, appears in numerous Romance languages as variances of the verb to live. Sarah, the subject of the first Final Fantasy quest ever, means princess in Hebrew, and Cain translates roughly as spear in the same language. Cain may also be a reference to the biblical deceiver who slew his brother and was branded an outcast by God. Some translations have even added meaning to words that had slim backgrounds to begin with. When 6 was translated into English, the protagonist, initially named Tina, which in Japanese is just a derivative of other female terms, was dubbed Terra by writer Ted Woosley, which means earth in Latin and monster in Greek. Once there was a crew to command, they were given attributes to aid them in battle and define their role in the party. Since Final Fantasy I, there have been 3 different ways to distribute them. The model used in the first game gave you options to mix and match, but the sprites themselves couldn't break out of their designated profession. This formula was repeated in 4, 9, 10, and to a lesser extent 6. 3 allowed you to swap job hats at random, and that system was refined in 5, 10.2, and the online 11. In parts 7, 8, and 12, classes held less weight, allowing you to customize your entire team to your liking. With the tools in place, you can't have good without evil. The villains of Final Fantasy have been known to steal the spotlight away from the honest heroes that fight bravely to stop them, but their defining qualities aren't always black and white. Some of the antagonists are fairly straightforward, though. Garland and the Emperor of Palamecia seemed maliciously trapped in their desire to dominate the world, but after Zand felt betrayed by Noah, he went on a revenge binge that has inspired several followers. These can occasionally obscure the true bad guy, as some would argue Hojo, or even Gast, is the true architect of Sephiroth's rage, and the murderous soldier was simply pushed too far. More often than not, there's more to the tale than meets the eye, such as Adia's reversal and eventual camaraderie. In a few others, the opposition you meet at the very beginning becomes the unthinkable evil you face in the end. The only antagonist who remained the sole architect of his world's demise from onset to conclusion was Kefka. No matter how fiercely you set your sights on the final fight, there's almost always one battle beyond it against who knows what. Only one constant remains. At some point, all their health bars have to hit 0. So you have your fighters, a call to action, a catalyst for Armageddon, and several symmetrically positioned temples housing exactly what you need to restore peace. All the good guys need now is a way to get there. The first transport earned in a Final Fantasy belonged to a pirate, and a crew of scallywags would give up their air or seafaring vessel again in 2, 5, and most recently 12. Canoes were issued late in 1 and earlier in 2, but only permitted river passage and were omitted from installment 3 onward. The canoe's cousin, the raft, appeared occasionally in 6 to split the party and, ironically, bring it back together. Boats began going below ocean level in 3, and submarines surfaced a second time in 5, and a third and last time in 7. 6, 7, and 8 all barely escaped from high-speed train sequences, from derailing to deboarding to fighting the engine itself. The hovercraft was exclusive to the 4th chapter until 8, when Balam Garden went mobile. 8 also contributed numerous four-wheelers to the long list of series vehicles. All of these modes of travel, whether manually operated or not, merely acted to redirect players until they were able to take flight. Airships have been in every core Final Fantasy game, and no resistance stood a chance without at least one, since they were prone to being destroyed and rebuilt. They first housed living quarters in 3, added tools and armaments in 4, morphed into multiple forms in 5, and migrated to Mode 7 in 6. Final Fantasy VII deployed choppers, 4 launched a spaceship, 8 stepped even further out into the stars, and 9 brought some of the original sprite concepts into 3D. 11 let you enjoy the view from the top deck, but 10, 10.2, and 12 all teleported you directly via short cutscenes. With the exception of 1 and 6, the majority of the world's aeronautic endeavors were conceived by one man. Cid's appearance and allegiance is never quite the same in each game, so it's always hard to guess what he'll look like or where the engineer might pop up. His name, Shido in Japanese, is rumored to come from the tale of the immortal Spanish conqueror El Cid, or from the engine tuning term representing cubic inches displaced, or CID for short. If Cid's not around, you can always make Talon tracks. Since Final Fantasy II, Chocobos have been willing to seek out the ends of the earth as long as you don't let go of the reins. They hid out in secret farms in 2, 3, and 4, started the trek from the get-go in 5, and became available for rent in 6. In 3D, they became less of a necessity and often required the dual act of taunting and taming. As extras, they hit the races in 7, a peripheral in 8, got hot and cold in 9, and finally followed you wherever you went, as long as you treated them right, in 11. Despite their mediocre significance in 10 and 12, they have yet to miss a game since their introduction. And it's impossible to imagine a Final Fantasy game without them. It's also difficult to conceive a world of crystals and chocobos without Moogles, who first appeared as Doga's security service in 3, but oddly skipped 4 entirely. They guided you to their hidden forest in 5, where you could briefly walk amongst their tribe, but they finally joined the party in 6, saving Terra from an advancing army, and introduced Mog, who could equip the invaluable Moogle charm that allowed you to journey without the worry of enemy encounters for the first time. Since then, Mog and his cuddly wanderers have appeared to facilitate anything from synthesis to saving your game to selling everyday items. Their name in Japanese is a fusion of the words for mole and bat. Despite these animal influences, their appearance has varied greatly over the years. About the only thing that remains the same is their trademark poof on a wire, or pom-pom. Moogles can preserve your progress, and Chocobos can chase the horizon for days, but you'll need some trusty steel to make it through each dungeon alive. Excalibur, from the King Arthur legend, and the Masamune, named after the Japanese swordsmith, have been top-tier blades since Game 1. The Bloodsword, Ragnarok, Save the Queen, and Ultima Weapon would challenge their supremacy in later installments. No matter what the class system, characters will often only be able to wield certain weapons. Class, along with Magicite and Zodiac crystals, also determines which characters can arm themselves with the deadliest artillery of all, summons. In some cases, these otherworldly creatures were atmosphere or merely another branch of spellcasting. However, infamous summoners such as the likes of Rydia, Garnet, and Ico, or the beings themselves, such as the Espers of 6 and the Faith of 10, were focal points and drove the plot forward. Espers, Eidolons, Avatars, or Aeons, they've had many monikers, reinventions, and systems. With the exception of the beings that made up the totema of Tactics Advance and the Espers of Final Fantasy XII, which were comprised of original concepts, as well as prior Final Fantasy nemesis, most of the summoned creatures throughout the series remained part of the same circle. The pool has ranged from being as few as 8 in its debut in 3 to as many as 27 in the original release of Final Fantasy VI. Most, if not all, of these astral creatures were inspired by classic mythology from a number of cultures. The two beings that appear most throughout the series, Ifrit and Shiva, reflect two cultures from which Final Fantasy drew a great amount of inspiration. In the Arabic tradition, the Afriti, or Afriti, were a violent and cruel race of genii that were often associated with fire. Shiva, one of the primary deities of the Hindu pantheon, was aligned to a number of abstract concepts, such as creation and destruction. Arabic myth also yielded Bahamut, a gigantic aquatic creature similar to a whale, that carried the bull Kuyata, another Final Fantasy summon, upon its back. From Hinduism, there was the gigantic Garuda, one of the mounts of the god Vishnu, as well as the goddess Lakshmi, the correctly translated form of Starlet, who is the matron of beauty and fertility. Hinduism also held the gods Rama, the seventh avatar of Vishnu, and Indra, a deity of weather and war, both of which inspired Ramu, who helped guide the player down the path of summoning in a number of games. The rarely referenced Judeo-Christian mythology inspired the great serpent Leviathan, which was mentioned several times in the Old Testament of the Bible. Egyptian culture called forth the phoenix, a beautiful golden bird that would burst into flames at the end of its life, only to rise again from the ashes, as well as the ancient citadel city of Alexandria, which inspired the summon Alexander. In addition to the many monsters Greek mythology threw at the players, it also contributed the summons Titan and Siren. The Titans were children of Uranus and Gaia, and precursors to the Olympian gods. The Sirens were vicious mermaid-like creatures whose deadly song has been set upon such heroes as Jason and Odysseus. Far to the north, the Norse traditions inspired the omnipotent Odin, father of the gods. In battle, he sat atop his 8-legged steed Sleipnir and wielded the mighty lance Gungnir. On the day of Ragnarok, the inevitable end of creation, the world would be torn apart by the great wolves Fenrir and Garm. Odin was fated to be devoured by Fenrir, who would be in turn slain by Odin's son. These are the basics when building a Final Fantasy RPG, but these quest ingredients typically only make up about 60% of the hours and hours fans are willing to invest in each game. The other 40% is filled with side stories, mini-games, and various added bonuses that are extra diversions for some players, but required material to others. When available, you could wager your weapons and your life in the Colosseum, become a bounty hunter of rare monsters, recruit additional party members, engage in a heated magic card confrontation, carve up a mountain, go for the gold inside a giant fishbowl, and much more. The story often set up these distractions, leaving the option open to unlock a rare treasure once the mode was mastered. All this is what it means to be Final Fantasy, but that's not to say multiple other role-playing franchises don't follow the same rules. As the magnitude of each adventure's time commitment and sales demonstrate, success requires one last crucial element: a brilliant creative staff. Hironobu Sakaguchi, despite doubts and disbelievers, was the mind that started it all. He directed the first 5 games in the series and produced the 7 installments after. Following 9, which he considered to be the finest example of what a Final Fantasy game should be, he founded Mistwalker Studios with Microsoft and officially left Square in 2003. It's difficult to accurately pinpoint specific details he's brought to the franchise over the years, outside of his leading roles, but obviously, Final Fantasy wouldn't exist without him. Nobuo Uematsu's influence cannot be understated. In his relationship with Square, he's composed over 600 tracks for Final Fantasy games, and that's just considering the core series. Over 50 of those have been character-specific themes. He started a music production company in 2004 called Smile Please, and has played keyboard for his FF-inspired metal band, the Black Mages, in at least 8 separate concert appearances and 2 albums. Although his primary focus now lies on Mistwalker projects, he contributes title anthems for Final Fantasy, and several songs he wrote 20 years ago are still irreversibly linked to the franchise. Yoshitaka Amano's illustrations, despite even today's standards of digital animation, are almost impossible to recreate in 3 dimensions, while still maintaining the original's intricate accents. His hand has stayed in the series from the very beginning, despite not designing characters for one of its games since 2001. He continues doing image illustration, logo design, and additional promotional artwork. When creative expression called for technical ingenuity, no single person has developed more systems for the series than Hiroyuki Ito. After sound designing and debugging the first 3 games, he formed Active Time Battles in 4, Jobs in 5, Espers in 6, and Junctioning in 8. He directed Final Fantasy IX and co-directed both 6 and 12. From advancement methods to combat pacing to party skill sets, Ito's code work stands as the foundation of each fantasy. Hundreds of creative minds have converged on the 12 core titles, but these 4 fantasy founders drew the blueprints that all others have followed. Final Fantasy V was the last game where they filled all of their original roles, but their inspirations will flourish in the sequels and spin-offs to come. They may not be the people behind the latest entries, but the franchise still has a bright future thanks to their legacy. Final Fantasy XIII is to be split into a 3-part series called Fabula Nova Crystallis that will include the 12th sequel and verses for the PS3, along with the Jito for mobile phones. Details at this point are vague, to say the least. While no remakes other than Final Fantasy IV DS are currently planned, a reunion brawler called Dissidia is coming to the PSP to pit the series' finest against each other, and end many popular fan debates once and for all. Looking back at 20 fantasy-filled years, it's a challenge not to marvel at the work put forth by Square and its eventual partner, Enix. Excluding ports and remakes, 27 games have been created that carry the brand, a library that can only be rivaled by Mario, Mega Man, and other pillars of gaming. As the franchise enters a third decade of development, its ultimate direction is unclear. The only thing final in Final Fantasy is its past. Sakaguchi's Hail Mary began with an orb, gathered light through a crystal, and will know no end as long as it lives in the hearts and minds of players around the world.